to that extent so much more primary and important than ours. Comme je dis l'autre jour, a growing list of rejected items means we are unable to bring into Gaza supplies to rehabilitate life-sustaining infrastructure. The system for medical evacuation of patients to Egypt is woefully inadequate in the face of the torrent of needs. Monsieur le Président, in these circumstances, the spread of hostilities further southwards would significantly increase pressure for the mass displacement of people into neighboring countries. And we know we have all been thinking of this eventuality and the problems it brings with it. Some countries have already offered to host civilians who want to leave Gaza for their protection. I would like, with your permission, to emphasize that any persons displaced from Gaza must be allowed to return as international law demands. In this context, we are, of course, deeply alarmed by recent statements by Israeli ministers regarding plans to encourage the mass transfer of civilians from Gaza to third countries, currently being referred to as, quote unquote, voluntary relocation, unquote. These statements raise grave concerns about the possible forcible mass transfer of deportation of the Palestinian population from the Gaza Strip, something that would be strictly prohibited, of course, under international law. And any attempt to change the demographic composition of Gaza must be firmly rejected. Monsieur le Président, while Gaza is the epicenter of this crisis, we never forget, and none of us should forget, the 1,200 people killed, thousands injured, hundreds taken in the brutal attack by Hamas and other armed groups on Israel on 7th of October. And I have seen, as have you and have many of us, the films of these attacks and the accounts of abhorrent sexual violence of those days. Rocket fire continues into populated areas of Israel, causing more civilian casualties and trauma. The families of the hostages of all people, have been waiting for the release of their loved ones for nearly 100 days. Some came out in that pause, that momentary pause we had of 5 days of a certain freedom, or at least for some information about their well-being. Unfortunately, since November, no hostages have been released, and no information has been shared with their families and loved ones. More than 100,000 people have been displaced within Israel. Also, let us not forget the effect of this war on Israel as a result of the 7th of October attack by Hamas and other armed groups, and due to the ongoing rocket fire, as I have myself experienced in Tel Aviv, from armed groups in Gaza and Lebanon. I remain extremely concerned by the risk of a further regional spread of this conflict. We're seeing already increasing tension and hostilities in the West Bank, where there have been continued Israeli raids against Palestinian towns, alarming increases in settler violence resulting in death, displacement, and the demolition of homes. And we are all aware, as of course will be discussed later, of the increasing tensions and military activity in Lebanon, the Red Sea, and my own favorite country, Yemen. We cannot allow this to metastasize further. The the consequences of a wider conflagration, as if this is not bad enough, would be unimaginable. Monsieur le Président, what we have seen since October the 7th is a stain on our collective conscience. Everyone in this room, everyone listening to these words. Unless we act, it will become more than that. An indelible mark on our claims to humanity. People will continue to suffer and to die from the rockets, the bombs, the missiles, the bullets, the lack of safety, the trials, the inadequate services, and the increasing numbers from starvation, disease, and exposure. And we heard yesterday reports that starvation, disease, and exposure are beginning to rival the impact of deaths and wounds and suffering on the people of Gaza from the bombing. We cannot let this happen. So of course, I reiterate my call for greater compliance for international humanitarian law. Ilse will be even more eloquent than me, including the protection of civilians, the infrastructure they depend on, the provision of essentials for survival, the facilitation of humanitarian assistance at the scale required, and the humane treatment and immediate release of all hostages. And as I did perhaps excessively, l'autre jour, l'autre soir,
today, this evening,
for a ceasefire. Most of all, I reiterate that call for a ceasefire, for this council to take urgent action to bring this war to an end. Monsieur Nicolas, je vous remercie.
Nicolas, I thank you.
Je remercie beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Griffiths, for your briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Ilse Brands-Keris.
Monsieur le Président, Excellences,
Presidents, Excellencies, it is an honor for me to address the Security Council on behalf of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The devastating situation and immense suffering we are seeing in Gaza are preventable and foreseeable, and this situation has been warned about for many weeks. The horror of the 7th of October attacks, for which there must be accountability, will not be forgotten. For Palestinians, the threat of forced displacement carries particular resonance. It is seared into Palestinian collective consciousness by what they refer to as the Nakba, or catastrophe, of 1948, when millions of Palestinians were forced from their homes. Since the 7th of October, roughly 1.9 million Palestinians, nearly 85% of Gaza's population, have been displaced. For many of them now, on multiple occasions, some have followed Israeli orders to leave certain areas, others fleeing for fear of also falling victim to violence and severe deprivation should they remain. Families have been separated, tens of thousands killed, and many thousands more seriously injured or remaining missing. Over 100,000 people have also been internally displaced in southern Israel as a result of the conflict in Gaza, as well as in northern Israel. Reportedly, Israel has put in place provisions for their displacement in satisfactory conditions. Excellencies.
what happened in Gaza is not just a byproduct of conflict, but is the direct result of the manner in which hostilities have been conducted. Massive displacement in Gaza commenced on 12th October with Israeli authorities' order to Palestinian civilians north of the Wadi Gaza to vacate their homes and go south. While Israel stated that its evacuation orders have been for the safety of Palestinian civilians, it appears that Israel has made scant provision to ensure such relocations comply with international law, in particular ensuring access to appropriate hygiene, health, safety, nutrition, and shelter, and taking steps to minimize the risk of separation of family members. Such compelled evacuations Failing to meet the necessary conditions for lawfulness, therefore potentially amount to forcible transfer, a war crime. In fact, these orders have often been confusing, requiring civilians to move to so-called humanitarian zones or known shelters, despite the fact that many such areas have been subsequently struck in Israeli military operations and the lack of any capacity in the shelters to absorb more people. OHCHR has documented how many civilians have sought in vain to find locations safe from Israel's massive bombardment and other military operations that have been continuing across the Gaza Strip, including in places specifically protected under international humanitarian law, such as hospitals and schools. The UN has documented 319 IDPs killed and 1,135 injured in UNRWA shelters alone since the 7th of October. More than 60% of people's homes have been damaged or destroyed across Gaza. Nowhere is safe. Compounding a 17-year-old blockade imposed by Israel, Israel is failing in its obligations, including as an occupying power, to facilitate entry of sufficient aid and essential commercial goods into Gaza to meet the basic subsistence needs of the civilian population. Distribution of the little aid available to those most in need, nursing mothers, pregnant women, infants and children, aged persons, persons with disabilities, is almost impossible. Hundreds of thousands are estimated to remain in northern Gaza, where almost no humanitarian aid has been permitted, and where the water supply has remained cut, forcing people south since the beginning of the conflict. More than 90% of the population is now suffering from acute food insecurity, and many are on the brink of avoidable, human-made famine. We recall that starvation of the civilian population as a method of war is prohibited. The unacceptably high civilian casualty rate, the nearly complete destruction of essential civilian infrastructure, the displacement of an overwhelming percentage of the population, and the abominable humanitarian conditions in which 2.2 million people are being forced to endure raise very serious concerns about the potential commission of war crimes, while the risk of further grave violations is there, even atrocity crimes, is very real. The prospect of widespread famine and disease as Palestinians are crammed into the tiniest slivers of the Gaza Strip along the Egyptian border in overcrowded and dire humanitarian conditions with insufficient aid and a collapse in provision of basic services, while Middle Gaza and Khan Yunis remain under sustained aerial bombardment, cumulatively heightens the risk of further massive displacement on a widening scale, potentially even beyond Gaza's borders. With people desperate for safety and security, this is a risk the Council must be alert to. As OHCHR has recently documented and reported, since 7th of October, violence by Israeli settlers and Israeli security personnel has also dramatically increased in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, leading to the displacement of many communities within an increasingly coercive environment, possibly constituting forcible transfer. This comes in a context marked by massive increases in the use of force by Israeli security forces, the detention of thousands of Palestinians, and extensive movement restrictions. The risk of an expanded and intense conflict in the West cannot be ruled out. Incendiary statements by some members of Israel's leadership pushing for permanent resettlement of Palestinians overseas have entrenched fears that Palestinians are being deliberately forced out of Gaza and will not be able to return. This must not be permitted. Palestinians' right to return to their homes must be subject to an ironclad guarantee. Even if needed, humanitarian corridors are open to allow Palestinians, especially the sick, persons with disabilities, older persons, and pregnant women and children, to flee, including to Israel and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Israel, as the occupying power, must support their return by restoring essential services and facilitating the necessary reconstruction of Gaza, particularly given that the scale of destruction and presence of unprecedented levels of explosive remnants of war mean that there are major practical obstacles to the near-term return home of most of those already displaced. Excellencies, we need an immediate ceasefire on human rights and humanitarian grounds, and the unconditional release of all hostages as indispensable first steps towards a durable solution. The protection of civilians must be prioritized, and they must be allowed to find safety and access to life-sustaining assistance wherever they are. Settler violence in the West Bank must be condemned and accountability pursued and settlements stopped. We must also look towards what comes next. This current violence comes in the context of decades of human rights violations. For any enduring solution to this crisis, the underlying root causes must be addressed, and this includes accountability for violations committed on and since 7th of October and in the many years before. Ensuring justice and the rights of all peoples, both of Palestinians and Israelis, are respected and protected is the only basis on which an enduring peace can be built. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank Ms. Eels-Bruns-Keris for her briefing, and I now open the floor for members of the Council who wish to make a statement. I begin with the representative of Algeria.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
At the outset, I would like to thank both Ms. Ilse Brandt-Keris and Mr. Martin Griffiths for their comprehensive briefings. We meet today while the Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people nears its 100th day. Shocking images reach us through our screens every hour and every day without any serious action to end the situation. And as the President of the Republic has affirmed, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, what is happening in Gaza will remain a disgrace on the conscience of humanity. Mr. President, we wonder today, and so wonder the people of the world. Is it not enough to kill more than 30,000 people, including more than 10,000 children? Is it not enough to injure more than 60,000 people? Is it not enough to destroy more than 60% of the buildings in Gaza? Is it not enough for the entire population of Gaza to face the risk of famine now? Yes, all of the population in Gaza. Will the international community accept that more than 2 million people suffer hunger and disease? Mr. President, the barbaric bombardment of Gaza and the destruction of its infrastructure and the targeting of all signs of life in Gaza clearly is a targeting of making Gaza uninhabitable. In addition, it seeks to kill the hope of returning home in the hearts and minds of the Palestinians in order to facilitate and implement the strategy of displacing the Palestinians outside their land. This is a policy that enjoys a lot of support among the officials of the occupying power today. The objective is to terminate the Palestinian question and by evacuating the occupied territory of its inhabitants. Yes, the entire occupied territory. at the time when we focus on Gaza, because the situation in Gaza has exceeded the worst that any human being can imagine, we must also not forget the West Bank and Jerusalem. The plan of forced displacement is unfolding now throughout the Palestinian territory through bombardment and destruction and through settlement and annexation. Mr. President, this plan is destined to fail. Our position must be clear in rejection of the forced displacement of Palestinians from their land. Everyone must understand that there is no place for Palestinians except on their land. Any displacement of the Palestinians is a clear violation of international law, in particular Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. The international community, in particular the Security Council, must speak with one strong voice against the displacement of the Palestinians. No one inside this chamber can remain silent as such plans unfold. Silence is complicity. Silence is complicity. In conclusion, Mr. President, we reiterate our call for an urgent and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. We also reiterate our support, our firm support of the Palestinian people until the establishment of their independent state with Jerusalem as its capital. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for that statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Undersecretary General Griffiths and Assistant Secretary General Brands Caris for your briefings. It has been more than 3 months since Hamas carried out the deadliest attack against Jews since the Holocaust and set this conflict into motion. A conflict that has killed and displaced far too many people. According to UN estimates, more than 1.8 million Palestinians in Gaza have been internally displaced. People are sheltering in overcrowded UN facilities. Others are living in the streets, entire families, young children, the elderly. The situation is heartbreaking and untenable, and the United States' position has been clear and consistent. Palestinian civilians in Gaza must be able to return home as soon as conditions allow. Just this week, while in the region, Secretary Blinken announced that Israel has committed to have the United Nations send an assessment team to the north of Gaza. The United States has also made clear that civilians must not be pressed to leave Gaza under any circumstances. We unequivocally reject statements by some Israeli ministers and lawmakers calling for a resettlement of Palestinians outside of Gaza. These statements, along with statements by Israeli officials calling for the mistreatment of Palestinian detainees or the destruction of Gaza, are irresponsible, inflammatory, and only makes it harder to secure a lasting peace. But just as these words send the wrong message, so too do the words we are not hearing from this council. Why can some council members still not bring themselves to condemn Hamas's horrific terrorist attack on October 7th? Why have some council members stopped talking about the plight of the more than 100 hostages being held by Hamas, or the fact that Hamas and Hezbollah continue to fire rockets on Israel? Roughly 250,000 Israelis are internally displaced because of these relentless attacks. And why have some council members refused to hold Hamas accountable for using civilians as human shields? We urge all member states to speak out and press Hamas and Hezbollah to do what is necessary to end the violence and displacement they have wrought. Colleagues, even as this council focuses on the conflict in Gaza, we must not turn our attention away from the West Bank, where there has been an unprecedented rise in violence in recent months. We've seen Palestinian extremist militants carry out attacks against Israeli civilians. We unequivocally condemn these attacks, just as we unequivocally condemn attacks by Israeli extremist settlers that target Palestinians and their property and displace entire communities. The United States strongly opposes the advancement of settlements in the West Bank, and we strongly oppose the violence that has come to characterize them. At their core, settlements undermine the geographic viability of a two-state solution, exacerbate tensions, and further harm trust between Israelis and Palestinians. At least 340 Palestinians in the West Bank have been killed by Israelis in the past 3 months. And I want to be clear, the United States will continue to respond to this escalating violence, including through our new visa restriction policy. Under this policy, we have taken steps to improve visa restrictions against individuals who are involved in or meaningfully contributing to the undermining of peace, security, or stability in the West Bank. But we know that this is just one piece of the broader picture. And we urge the Israeli government to prevent and investigate settler violence and hold extremists who perpetuate it to account. We also urge the Israeli government to exercise restraint in its operations in the West Bank by respecting civilian infrastructure, especially in refugee camps, and minimizing civilian harm. Finally, we have long maintained that stability in the West Bank is dependent on PA security forces. That means the PA must make steps toward reform and revitalization. And it means Israel must release revenues that allow the PA to pay their security forces. Colleagues, at this profoundly difficult moment, the United States has stepped up to lead and to advance a vision for a lasting peace, where Israel is integrated into the region and terrorist groups can no longer threaten Israel's security, where Palestinians realize their aspirations for a state of their own, and Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank are unified under the Palestinian Authority, where Israelis and Palestinians live side by side in peace with equal measures of security, freedom, and dignity. This is the only way forward. This is the only way to end this terrible cycle of violence once and for all. The damning reality is that Israelis and Palestinians will forever be scarred by years and years of mistrust and fear and violence. But the generations that follow need not know this reality. So let us work together to sow the seeds of peace. That must be our charge. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
We wish to thank the representative of the United States for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель.
President, we thank the Undersecretary General Martin Griffiths and the ASG Ilse Brands-Karras for their assessment of the catastrophic situation in the Gaza Strip. The Russian Federation supported Algeria's initiative to convene today's extraordinary council meeting on the situation in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict zone, focusing on the threat of the forced transfer of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, guided by the unlawfulness of these steps taken by West Jerusalem under international law. This is only part of the bloody puzzle that makes up the picture of the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. As of now, the enclave has seen 23,000 deaths. Preliminary figures alone point to over 7,500 children, and thousands of people are still buried under the ruins. Given the pace and the power of the strikes in populated areas, every day in Gaza there are deaths and maimings of dozens, if not hundreds, of Gazans. Civilian infrastructure, including medical sites, is practically destroyed. The total blockade of the Gaza has led to an acute lack of water, fuel, and medications. From the beginning of the conflict, around 2 million people have been compelled to leave their homes. Half of them are women and children. Most of the internally displaced persons, or to be more precise, forcibly transferred persons, have found refuge in UNRWA institutions, which, despite their status, have continued to be subject to Israeli bombing. These people have been stripped of their homes, property, livelihoods, and many are teetering on the brink of inevitable starvation. The ghastly humanitarian situation in Gaza demonstrates how catastrophic it could be to continue along the path of ignoring international law. The 7th of October attacks, of course, are reprehensible. At the same time, these events cannot legitimize Israel's indiscriminate use of force in the Gaza Strip, especially because this form of carrying out hostilities, which is in fact becoming a collective punishment of the Palestinians, is linked with many gross violations of international law. Moreover, the October 7th events should not be viewed in isolation from the long, bloody history of Palestinian and Israeli confrontation, which has dragged on for several decades and is linked with oppression, occupation, and many crimes against the Palestinian people. Against this backdrop, the UN Security Council, as the chief body for the maintenance of international peace and security, has still failed to shoulder its direct mandate and adopt a resolution containing an unequivocal call to the parties to immediately implement a ceasefire. We regret to note that Security Council Resolution 2712 did not contain this key call. That was due to U.S. opposition. So the practical significance of that resolution verges on nothing. Resolution 2720, from which we abstained upon the request of the Arab states, under U.S. pressure, is saturated with highly dubious calls to create the condition for the cessation of hostilities. I want to stress once more that we flatly oppose the content of the current OP2 of Resolution 27.2, and I want to say that the responsibility for the possible impact of that resolution lies with the states that gave their consent to its drafting which was rammed through by the U.S. Mr. President, together with the constant indiscriminate bombings and targeted strikes on civilian objects intended to sow fear and panic among civilians, we see the holistic strategy of West Jerusalem to forcibly displace the Palestinians. The logic here is simple: making life unbearable in Gaza, even impossible, leaving civilians with an impossible choice: leave their native lands or be killed. The ongoing violent expulsion of Palestinians from the West Bank and from Gaza will inevitably shake the entire Middle East and North African region, with dire consequences for the whole world. The UN Secretariat, headed by the Secretary General, and the overwhelming majority of the UN member states have sounded the alarm, condemning these steps by the Israeli leadership, and they are united in their striving to take decisive action to prevent this mass violent deportation of Palestinians from their lands. The Israeli side is obligated to abide by the norms of international humanitarian law, specifically Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, which directly bans the deportation and violent transfer of persons enjoying protection. Pursuant and 59 of this Fourth Geneva Convention, occupying powers have a special obligation to ensure that civilians have basic goods. Against that backdrop, given major concern is elicited by Israel's plans to flood the Gaza tunnels. According to basic estimates, we're talking about 1,300 corridors. They are 500 kilometers in length. They're going to be flooding them with 1.5 million cubic meters of water. I want to stress in particular that the impact of the contamination of this groundwater, which is Gaza's only fresh water source, that these implications will continue for 100 years. Taking this step threatens a major environmental disaster, but it will also make the territory of the enclave unsuitable for life. These steps could be qualified as one element of genocide in accordance with Article 2C of the 1948 Convention on the Prevention of the Crime of Genocide and on its punishment. Pursuant to complaints have been lodged against Israel in the International Court of the UN by South Africa, Bangladesh, Bolivia, the Comoros, and Djibouti. And this is in addition to what's happening, will be happening in the later half of February in The Hague. The hearings on the legal consequences of Israel's settlements in occupied Palestinian territory. Given this, can we count on an appropriate assessment of what is happening from bought and paid for bodies such as the ICC? No, we cannot. We have no illusions that the British prosecutor of the ICC, Karim Khan, will screw up his courage to oppose his Western backers and their allies, because this body is intended to serve their political interests. There's similar inaction by the ICC that we've seen in connection with the war crimes of the U.S., Great Britain, and their satellites in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. After the investigation was not started, it was simply deprioritized. As for Israel, the head of ICC is acting in the same way. He's limiting himself to incoherent justifications and mentioning some previous calls for stopping the violence. Against this grim backdrop, what is striking are media reports of the idea of Israeli leadership that they're going to convince Arab, African, and European countries to take in Palestinian refugees, and they want Arab monarchies to bankroll this transfer. The very fact of these leaks, coupled with the ongoing provocative statements by the Israeli establishment, this provokes additional tensions and undermines the universally acknowledged international legal basis for an Israeli-Palestinian peace process, the consistent erosion of which by Washington has led to the current explosion. Now, Russia's approach is unchanged. We want an immediate ceasefire. We want untrammeled, safe humanitarian access, release of hostages, and reestablishment of a political horizon for the Middle East peace process based on the two-state solution. The escalation in Gaza has continued for over 100 days with no sign of abating. Moreover, the U.S. and its allies have single-handedly triggered a spillover of the conflict to the entire region, having attacked yesterday, in violation of Article 2 of the UN Charter, the people of Yemen. The Council will be discussing this egregious situation a bit later in a separate briefing. Apparently, this effective bilateral diplomacy in the region, or to put it more simply, this arbitrary act, apparently this is what our American colleagues are referring to when they're saying that they are acting better than multilateral efforts. This all leads to one chief conclusion. Without an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the Middle East risks plunging into an abyss of a full-fledged war with the direst of global repercussions. The UN Security Council has the obligation to, again, consider this matter forthwith. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador. Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I wish to thank the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, and I also wish to thank the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, Ms. Eels-Brands-Keris. I thank both for the somber reports that we've just heard. At the same time, I reiterate Ecuador's support for their work. More than a year ago, in the first statement we made as non-permanent members of the Security Council on this issue, my delegation called for incendiary statements to stop. Such statements exacerbate conflict conflict and incite violence. Today, this meeting has been convened in view of the concern prompted over exactly such statements that are today being made in much more difficult circumstances. Mr. President, this Council has been clear in rejecting the forced displacement of the civilian population, including of children, in violation of international law, including of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The Council has done so twice in the last 60 days in Resolutions 2712 and 2720. In Resolution 2720, the Council underscored the fact that the Gaza Strip constitutes an integral part of the territory occupied in 1967. It reiterated the desire to see a two-state solution under which the Gaza Strip forms part of the Palestinian government, says the Speaker. Ecuador reiterates the fact that it agrees absolutely with what the Council has said. We also insist upon the need to achieve a peaceful, negotiated, definitive solution, and one which is just to both parties, with the existence of two states, Palestine and Israel, on the basis of 1967 borders and on the basis of relevant resolutions. Mr. President, colleagues, in the last days, we have received a report from the Secretary General on the implementation of Resolution 2712. That report clearly states that the provisions of that resolution are far from being upheld. The report also makes it clear that the progress made falls woefully short of that required. Events on the ground tell of incessant violence, of more people being killed and wounded, and of a humanitarian situation which is unsustainable and which is worsening day by day. Hamas hostages continue to be held hostage. The civilian population remains displaced, and there is an increasing risk of the violence spreading to the wider region. Ultimately, we're seeing how, regrettably, the provisions of this Council have a limited impact on reality. In light of that fact, we believe that it is patently clear that without a humanitarian ceasefire, it is impossible to implement the provisions that have been adopted. However, we cannot lose heart. It is our duty to continue working and to do everything we can to ensure that the situation improves. As such, we welcome the opening of the Kerem Shalom crossing by Israel. That has allowed humanitarian aid to enter the Gaza Strip through a second location. Turning to Resolution 2720, we value the expeditious nature of the Secretary General's appointment of Sigrid Kaag as Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator. We wish her every success in her work, and we hope to see the timely implementation of the UN mechanism for speeding up the provision of humanitarian relief consignments to Gaza. Moreover, Resolution 2720 calls for the creation of conditions for a cessation of hostilities which is sustainable in nature. We call for progress to be made along that path. To conclude, Mr. President and colleagues, I reiterate the fact that Ecuador condemns the atrocious terrorist acts perpetrated by Hamas, which began on the 7th of October. We condemn sexual violence and all acts of violence perpetrated against civilians. I reiterate our call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Meanwhile, we must guarantee humanitarian access to meet their medical needs, as demanded by Resolutions 2712 and 2720. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I join others in thanking Under-Secretary General Griffiths and Assistant Secretary Brants-Keris for their briefings today. President, I have 3 points to make today. Firstly, the UK firmly rejects any proposal that Palestinians should be resettled outside Gaza, including proposals from members of the Israeli government. Our views and concerns are shared by our allies and partners that Gazans should not be subject to forcible displacement or relocation from Gaza. Second, the UK is alarmed by record levels of extremist settler violence in the occupied Palestinian territories and its devastating impact. According to OCHA, since the 7th of October, at least 198 Palestinian households, including 586 children, have been displaced following an increase in extremist settler violence and access restrictions. We call on the government of Israel not only to condemn settler violence, but also to take direct action against those responsible for it and hold them accountable and ensure that Palestinian civilians are protected. We also continue to call on Israel to cease immediately all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and its lower aqueduct, and to respect their in their absolute entirety all legal obligations. We reiterate our long-standing position that settlements are illegal under international law and that settlement expansions hinder us from creating the conditions for a durable peace in Israel, the West Bank, and across all the occupied Palestinian territories. Third, the UK is intensely focused on ensuring more aid gets into Gaza. The current levels are woefully inadequate for the deepening humanitarian crisis. We're deeply concerned that the World Food Programme is reporting that 9 out of 10 families are going with less than 1 meal a day. We want to see a ceasefire, but this must be a sustainable ceasefire, one that will last. A sustainable ceasefire means one in which Hamas no longer poses a threat to Israel's security. Aid is delivered without hindrance, and Palestinians can return to the areas of Gaza from which they have been displaced. Ahead of a permanent ceasefire, we want to see immediate and sustained humanitarian pauses. This will allow for hostages to be released and more aid to enter Gaza. In accordance with Security Council Resolution 2720, we call on Israel to allow for higher volumes of humanitarian aid through as many routes as possible. In conclusion, Mr. President, we call again for the release of hostages taken on the 7th of October, for measures to allow desperate humanitarian need in Gaza, for a sustainable ceasefire with a political horizon towards a two-state solution. And we remain committed to working with Israelis, Palestinians, and all parties in the region and beyond to make this a reality. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for that statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank Algeria for the initiative to hold this meeting, and USG Griffiths and ASG Carries for their briefings. Nearly 100 days into the ongoing Palestinian-Israeli conflict, more than 23,000 people in Gaza and over 200 UN personnel and journalists have lost their lives. 90% of the population of Gaza has been displaced. More than 60% of homes have been destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people are struggling to survive in makeshift tents. All of these are not just the cold numbers, but the loss of human lives and the suffering that is experienced on a daily basis. Today, in the 21st century, the records that keep getting broken are none other than those of war and their death tolls. This is a stain on human conscience that can never be scrubbed off. An immediate ceasefire has become the overwhelming call of the international community. But a permanent member of the Security Council has been using various excuses to veto consensus on this issue in the Security Council. This is a blatant contempt of international fairness and justice and the authority of the Security Council. Some people have constantly talked about the protection of human rights and the prevention of genocide. In the face of the appalling situation in Gaza, they have played dumb, kept stonewalling, and attempted to deflect attention. This is downright double standards. It is imperative that we remove all interference and take robust action to end the fighting, save lives, and restore peace. First, any forced displacement of the Palestinian people must be firmly rejected. Gaza is the homeland of the Palestinian people. Over the past 3 months, over 1 million people have been forced to relocate again and again, but in the face of the constant threat of death, they have nowhere to hide and nowhere to flee. Some Israeli political figures have called for voluntary emigration from Gaza, over which we express our grave concern. That would mean driving 2 million population out of Gaza and turning Gaza into a so-called safe zone devoid of human habitation. If put into practice, such a horrific idea would constitute atrocity crimes under international law and would completely destroy the prospect of the two-state solution. We have taken note of some statements and clarifications made by Israel in this regard. But on this issue, while what is said is important, what is done is even more important. We are paying close attention to Israel's declared intentions, while at the same time paying more attention to its serious consequences in reality. Secondly, all measures must be taken to alleviate the humanitarian disaster. At present, access to humanitarian supplies is extremely limited. Food, medicine, and other essential supplies are extremely scarce. Disease and hunger are spreading in Gaza, and social order is on the verge of collapse. Secretary General Guterres has repeatedly emphasized that conditions for delivering humanitarian aid in Gaza do not exist under gunfire. It is Israel that has continued its indiscriminate bombardment against Gaza and has placed numerous obstacles blocking access to humanitarian supplies. But it is also Israel that has accused the United Nations of not having the will and ability to provide humanitarian assistance. This is totally unacceptable. Security Council resolutions 2712 and 2720 must be fully implemented. Israel must fulfill its obligations as the occupying power, ensure the safety of humanitarian workers, and provide full cooperation in humanitarian relief efforts. China welcomes the concrete proposals by Secretary General Guterres on the implementation of Resolution 2712 and the appointment of Ms. Kag as UN Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza. China supports further action by the Security Council to clear obstacles to the safe, rapid, and unimpeded entry of sufficient humanitarian supplies into Gaza. Thirdly, a ceasefire must be promoted with the utmost urgency. Only a ceasefire can prevent greater civilian casualties and humanitarian disasters, and create conditions for the early release of all hostages. Only a ceasefire can prevent the foundation of the two-state solution from being completely destroyed, and only a ceasefire can prevent the entire Middle East region from being devoured by a calamity. However, it is worrying that instead of seeing the prospect of an immediate ceasefire, the situation is heading towards the expansion of the conflict. We urge the international community, especially countries with major influence, to make the realization of a ceasefire the overriding urgent task. We call Israel to reverse course immediately and stop its indiscriminate military attacks on and the destruction of Gaza. In the West Bank, Israel should effectively curb settler violence and stop the searches, arrests, and raids against the Palestinians. Israel should transfer seized tax revenue to the Palestinian National Authority as soon as possible. We are concerned about the spillover effects of the Gaza conflict on the situation in the Red Sea. The military action launched by US and the UK against Yemen will undoubtedly exacerbate regional tensions. We call on all parties to effectively abide by the UN Charter and international law and to make joint efforts to maintain peace and security in the Red Sea and the Middle East. Thank you, President.
Je remercie le représentant de la...
I thank the representative of China for that statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank Under-Secretary General Griffiths and Assistant Secretary General Brans-Harris for their most pertinent briefings. At the outset, we must stress that the catastrophic situation in Gaza is causing immense levels of death, suffering, and displacement amongst the civilian population. Millions of civilians are enduring the deprivation of basic necessities, leading to a staggering loss of life. This plight is no more tragic than when one considers the humanitarian consequences this has on women and children, who suffer disproportionately from food insecurity, malnutrition, and the crippling healthcare system. We reiterate that there is an urgent need to genuinely facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid into and within Gaza, including through the opening of additional crossing points. Furthermore, all arbitrary bureaucratic impediments to humanitarian operations must cease. Equally fundamental is the need to ensure and safeguard the safety of UN and humanitarian workers, including the security of their premises. The rising death toll amongst humanitarian, Palestinian Red Crescent Society and UNRWA staff is unacceptable. Within this context, Malta calls for the immediate and full implementation of Security Council Resolutions 2712 and 2720. We look forward to working with the newly appointed Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, Ms. Sigrid Kaag, towards ensuring this. President, we must also not forget the plight of those hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza. In accordance with Resolution 2712, Malta calls for the immediate and safe release of the remaining hostages. We unreservedly condemn the Hamas terror attacks of 7th October, including the recurring rocket fire into Israeli territory, and further denounce any acts of sexual violence committed. Malta emphasizes the utmost importance of adhering to international humanitarian law and accountability for those who violate it. It is imperative that all parties take the necessary measures to safeguard civilians and protect civilian infrastructure. Likewise, attacks on religious sites and individuals seeking refuge within them are unacceptable, as are any deliberate targeting of journalists in the conflict. President, we remain convinced of the need for an urgent cessation of hostilities. The establishment of a humanitarian ceasefire is the only way through which a meaningful and effective humanitarian response throughout the entirety of Gaza can be mounted. This cessation of hostilities is also critical within the context of the displacement of the Palestinian people. Palestinians in Gaza must be allowed to return to their homes or provided with adequate and safe shelter until their homes are rebuilt. The forced displacement of populations and the transfer of populations from occupied territory is a grave violation of international law and a war crime under the Fourth Geneva Convention. We reject any attempts regarding the forced or coercive transfer of Palestinian people out of Gaza. Statements to this effect from figures within the Israeli government are deeply regrettable. We are also deeply concerned that in the past weeks we have witnessed a resurgence of forced transfer of Palestinian communities linked to demolitions, illegal settler encroachment, and violence in the West Bank. Malta strongly stresses that settlements violate international law, obstruct peace, and threaten the viability of an independent, contiguous Palestinian state. Israeli settler violence is unacceptable and must be addressed without impunity. Such action also inflames tensions and risk a further spillover of the conflict. All parties must mitigate any threats which inflame regional tensions, including escalations on the Blue Line and in the Red Sea. The universal norms of international law must be respected on all fronts. A fundamental recommitment to political dialogue, which is based on the realization of a two-state solution, has never been more essential. Malta reiterates its conviction that the only viable path to achieving peace lies within the internationally agreed parameters of the two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as the future capital of two states, living side by side in peace and security. Thank you.
Je remercie la
I thank the representative of Malta for that statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG Griffiths and ASG Brands-Caris for their valuable briefings. Mr. President, 3 months have passed since the heinous acts of terror were committed by Hamas and other militant groups. Since then, Gaza has been under heavy bombardments and relentless shelling, making Gaza as one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes witnessed today. The extent of the suffering in Gaza is unimaginable. At least 23,000 Palestinians have been reportedly killed in Gaza, including a heartbreaking loss of over 10,000 children. Over 85% of the population across the Gaza Strip have been displaced. Critical civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and UN shelters, have not been spared from attacks. Famine is imminent, and those internally displaced are at high risk of communicable diseases due to extremely poor living conditions. Humanity is in crisis. The international community must continue to work with a greater sense of urgency towards alleviating the humanitarian disaster in Gaza. We fully support the recent appointed UN Senior Coordinator, Ms. Sigrid Kaag, and her staff to this end. While the Security Council adopted Resolution 2712 and 2720, regrettably, their effective implementation remains elusive due to the ongoing heavy fighting. As violent regional spillover is already happening, what is most urgent is the de-escalation of the conflict. In this regard, our position is clear as shown in our voting positions in relevant resolutions, including the UNGA resolution adopted on December 12 last year. We would also like to emphasize once again the hostages held by Hamas and other militant groups must be released immediately and unconditionally to create better conditions towards easing tensions. Mr. President, Japan is concerned about the recent inflammatory rhetoric by Israeli ministers on the, quote, resettlement, unquote, of Palestinians outside of the Gaza Strip. Any attempt to forcibly displace the Palestinian people is inconsistent with the relevant Security Council resolutions and in violation of international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. We reject any such forced displacement. We also stress the need to create conditions to enable displaced Palestinians in Gaza to return safely to their homes. In this regard, we note recent reports that Israel has agreed to allow the UN to carry out an assessment mission in northern Gaza. We should create a conducive environment where the residents can return safely to their homes. In conclusion, Japan will continue to exert its utmost efforts to contribute to the de-escalation of this conflict within and beyond Gaza. A two-state solution remains the only viable path for both Israel and the future independent Palestinian state, which must include the Gaza Strip and the West Bank to live side by side in mutual peace and security. I thank you, President.
Je remercie
I thank the representative of Japan for that statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I also would like to thank Undersecretary General Griffith and Assistant Secretary Brans-Keris for their very sober and yet very clear briefings. Looking at the situation in Gaza and the broader Middle East region, we believe it is high time to reflect on our responsibility as the Council. Slovenia shares the concerns of briefers regarding the several recent statements by members of the Israeli government proposing mass displacement of Palestinians from Gaza, and we strongly reject them. Any displacement of the Palestinian population from Gaza would constitute a grave breach of international humanitarian law, amounting to a war crime. We condemn such statements, which are only escalating tensions. Secondly, we are appalled by the current conditions in which internally displaced people of Gaza are living. 85% of Gaza's population is displaced. Military operations, including indiscriminate bombardment, are forcing people to flee over and over again. As the recent report of the Secretary General has outlined, Gaza is facing widespread death and destruction. Famine looms rampant. There is an evolving public health catastrophe, with children, pregnant women, and older among those most at risk. There is a dire need to scale up humanitarian aid and allow rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian assistance. In this regard, we welcome the appointment of Ms. Sigrid Kaag as a senior humanitarian and reconstruction coordinator for Gaza and stand ready to support her. Throughout the conflict, we have repeatedly called for full respect of international humanitarian law and human rights law. I would like to voice our concern over the grave violations we are witnessing in Gaza. All the reports we are receiving on the humanitarian situation demonstrate that Gaza is uninhabitable. People have been seeking shelter at hospitals and UNRWA facilities, which are overcrowded and without adequate sanitation facilities, and even those have been bombed. Civilians have been sheltering in the so-called safe zones, which have been bombed as well. Mr. President, the bottom line is that no place in Gaza is safe. So where will these people return? We are talking about whole neighborhoods reduced to rubble, roads and infrastructure related to water, electricity, sewage. The most basic infrastructure has been damaged. Hospitals, religious sites, schools, museums, the ancient port of Gaza, and more destroyed. Of course, we are aware of Hamas using some civilian infrastructure to continue its attacks on Israel. Of course, we are aware of the brutality of the October 7 attack on Israeli civilians. We are deeply concerned by the information about sexual violence by Hamas, which needs to be investigated and addressed. And we are calling on Hamas to immediately release all hostages so they can return to their families. But that cannot and does not justify destroying disproportionately civilian infrastructure and life in Gaza. Condemning the statements on displacements is not enough. We need to prevent actions leading to displacements. Displacement does not necessarily be a forced one, but could happen because of Palestinians not having anywhere to return. This brings me to my last point, Mr. President. Before we can enable the UN to deliver enough humanitarian assistance to people of Gaza, before we can start creating conditions for a safe return, we need to demand an immediate ceasefire. A ceasefire that would stop destruction of Gaza, that would return the hostages, and that would help us calm the region. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank you for convening this meeting. Let me also thank USG, Mr. Martin Griffiths, and ASG, Ms. Ilza Brandt-Keris, for their important briefing. Mr. President, when Sierra Leone first addressed this agenda item the situation in the Middle East in the Security Council in May 1970, our representative stated that the plight of the Palestinian refugees is great. Development and progress are a matter of urgency for both Arabs and Jews. Surely, it is in the interest of mankind that we should all seek passionately and persistently a way towards peace and allow the process of conciliation and reconciliation. More than half a century later, we are convened in this chamber to address the threat of forced displacement of Palestinians in Gaza. In the context of the continuing occupation by Israel of the Palestinian territories and the escalation following the 7th October 2023 heinous attacks by Hamas, Sierra Leone has and continues to condemn in the strongest terms the heinous attack against Israeli civilians by Hamas and the taking of hostages. Sierra Leone emphasizes our call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, noting that the taking of hostages is a serious breach of international law. We also strongly condemn attacks on civilians, Palestinian civilians, and civilian infrastructure. The practice of collective punishment and forced displacement of Palestinian people. As reported by the Secretary General, 1.9 million Palestinians are internally displaced and are mostly sheltering in or around the vicinity of UNRWA installations in Gaza. We reject any attempt to remove Palestinians from the Gaza Strip or the West Bank, either temporarily or for a long time period. We deeply reject the unacceptable high human cost with report of the killings of about 23,000 Palestinian civilians since the 7th October 2023, with women and children being the most affected. We regret the ultimate cost being paid by UN and other humanitarian workers and journalists. Sierra Leone calls for accountability for all those responsible for violations of international law, in particular international humanitarian law, and those crimes of serious concern to the international community. Mr. President, in the past 3 months, we have witnessed a situation that has become increasingly precarious, leading to the breakdown of systems, loss of lives, and destruction of civilian infrastructure in the Gaza Strip. A situation that has deepened the complexity of the Middle East Palestinian question, with ramifications for regional escalation. We note with grave concern the severe humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip due to the continuous violence and denial of access to life-saving humanitarian aid at the scale and means necessary. We call on all parties to comply with this Council's resolutions 2712, 2720, and their obligations under international law to allow for rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access to the civilians in need. Sierra Leone therefore calls for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, which in our view will bring an end to the atrocities, reduce regional tensions, and allow for the consolidation of ongoing humanitarian efforts by the United Nations and other international partners geared towards having an effective humanitarian aid operation in the Gaza Strip. In closing, Sierra Leone reiterates its call for political and diplomatic efforts to facilitate the two-state solution that will ensure Israel and Palestine live side by side in long-lasting peace and security. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also join in thanking Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths and Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, Ilse Kerrith, for their briefing today. More than 3 months have now passed since the horrendous terrorist attacks by Hamas on the 7th of October, which we condemn in the strongest terms. Since then, hostilities have been ongoing in Gaza and Israel, and the consequences are extremely alarming. USG Martin Griffith last week characterized the situation on the ground, that Gaza has become a place of death and despair. Civilians in Gaza, including women and children, have no safe place, as even hospitals are being besieged by military operations and airstrikes. Today, USG Martin Griffith briefed to the members of the Security Council that there has barely been any improvement on the humanitarian situation in Gaza, despite adoption of Resolution 2712 and 2720. In his alarming letter to the Council last week, Secretary General Guterres also detailed that the level of aid to Palestinians in Gaza is completely inadequate for 2 million people as widespread famine looms. Mr. President, more sustainable humanitarian pauses that can lead to a sustainable cessation of hostilities are of utmost importance. Based on these, delivery of critical humanitarian aid must be expanded and expedited. Countless trucks with humanitarian aids from numerous countries are lining up, waiting for their turn to enter Gaza, which myself witnessed in my trip to Rafah crossing. Mr. President, the Palestinian people's right to live on their own land must be guaranteed. Individual or mass forcible transfer of Palestinians outside Palestine, including the Gaza Strip, is simply not acceptable. In this regard, we have deep concerns over Israeli high-level officials' comments suggesting mass displacements or the so-called voluntary migration of Palestinians out of Gaza. We are also extremely alarmed by these inflammatory remarks by various Israeli ministers that Israel must resettle the Gaza Strip. Security Council Resolution 2334, adopted in 2016, clearly condemns all measures aimed at altering the demographic composition, character, and status of the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including the transfer of Israeli settlers and the displacement of Palestinian civilians. Any such act is in violation of international humanitarian law and relevant Security Council resolutions. All settlement activities must be ceased, and Gaza must not be resettled. Resolution 2334 also calls upon the parties to refrain from provocative actions, incitement, and inflammatory rhetoric. The rhetoric of high-level Israeli officials, including multiple ministers, on the possible forced displacement of Palestinians does not in any way help to ease the tension that is widespread all around the Middle East. Mr. President, we all know, and every member in this chamber keep reaffirming, that the only possible way to stop the cycle of violence is through the realization of the state solution, with both Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders consistent with international law and the relevant UN resolutions. Any acts or statements that hinder the realization of this aspiration of the world must stop immediately. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I express my appreciation to Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths and Assistant Secretary General Elise Brands-Keris for their sobering and informative briefing. Mr. President, Guyana is deeply concerned about the forced displacement of the population in Gaza since 7th of October. We take note that many Palestinians in Gaza have been displaced multiple times within the territory. We are now alarmed at the statements emanating from certain officials suggesting that the Palestinian people in Gaza should be forcibly transferred out of the territory to countries in the region and elsewhere. Guyana rejects these proposals and calls on this Council to do all within its power to protect the Palestinian population in Gaza from such a plight reminiscent of 1948. We must condemn in no uncertain terms these and all other suggestions which purport to violate international law, sending a strong message to the authors of these suggestions that they cannot carry out such actions unopposed. Mr. President, the displacement of the population in Gaza is distressing to Guyana on two fronts. First, the circumstances under which people have been uprooted from their homes and livelihoods have created a catastrophic humanitarian situation involving disease, destruction, danger, and death. Palestinian men, women, and children have been herded into smaller and smaller spaces in the Gaza Strip and forced to eke out an existence in the most inhumane conditions and without an adequate supply of food, water, medicine, fuel, and other basic items essential for survival. Social services, including the delivery of quality education and healthcare, have been severely disrupted. Women are unable to give birth, a most sacred experience in a safe environment. There is acute food insecurity, sparking legitimate concerns about mass starvation and death as famine looms. As if these conditions were not bad enough, these displaced persons live with the constant threat of bombs and bullets destroying or maiming them and their loved ones. Mr. President, the second element of concern to Guyana, particularly if there are mass forced transfers outside of Gaza, relates to the implications for the two-state solution. The prospects for a Palestinian state cannot be divorced from the necessity of the Palestinian people inhabiting the territory that pertains to them. Forcibly removing Palestinians from Gaza undermines these prospects, and coupled with an expanding settler policy in the West Bank, leaves no doubt about the likely fate of the two-state solution. In this context, Guyana underscores the importance of advancing the implementation of Security Council Resolutions 242, 338, 1397, and other relevant resolutions for realization of this two-state solution. Mr. President, we must tackle these issues frontally. Guyana was encouraged by the earlier public assurances from the Israeli government that it has no intention of displacing the civilian population of Gaza. But pronouncements by some Israeli officials give reason for real worry. Israel's actions must be in tandem with their earlier assurances. The first and most critical step at this stage, Mr. President, is a cessation of all hostilities, an immediate ceasefire. Outside of this, displacement will continue because people will have to keep moving in the hope of finding safety somewhere in the hell that is Gaza right now. Mr. President, Ghana wants to partner with this Council and the international community to end the indignity that the people of Gaza are enduring. We are prepared to work hard with everyone to end this war and to rebuild and reconstruct lives. Most importantly, we are prepared, as we have always been, to work with everyone to find a path to advance the two-state solution. Palestinians and Israelis alike deserve lasting peace and security. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I wish to thank the People's Democratic Republic of Algeria for calling this briefing on the humanitarian situation in Gaza, with particular focus on the forced displacement of the Palestinian people. We also thank the briefers, Mr. Martin Griffiths, and the Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, and Ms. Ilse Brands-Kerris, Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, for their assessment on the situation in Gaza. Mr. President, after 3 months of war, the situation in Gaza is dire, with endless death, forced relocations, unparalleled health catastrophe, famine, and no prospect or hope for Gaza. Forced displacement and limits on humanitarian aid are not acceptable. Innocent civilians are those who suffer the most. It is our duty to uphold respect and dignity. In fact, the United Nations has reported that the Gaza Strip continues to suffer from intense bombardments that have caused immense casualties and destruction of vital civilian infrastructure, creating a total crisis. These actions violate the international humanitarian law, human rights law, and the Geneva Convention on Displaced Persons. The peak of regional escalation of the conflict in the Middle East has reached the highest level. It is therefore imperative that these conflicts cease immediately before the consequences spread any further, or it will be too late to stop and limit its repercussions. As Council members, we have an obligation to ensure moderation and restraint. International conflict laws must take precedence over these actions, and all actors must halt violence and military operations. An immediate ceasefire is our best hope, as it would allow humanitarian access under United Nations Security Council Resolution 2712 and 2720. And most importantly, it would potentially enable negotiation towards peace. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Mr. Filippo Grandi, and I quote, "Resolving forced displacement is not only a moral or humanitarian imperative, but also deals with issues at the heart of the Security Council's mandate to maintain international peace and security." End of quote. Finally, Mr. President, in order to resolve the Gaza crisis, Mozambique called upon all parties to exercise maximum restraint and return to dialogue before the situation deteriorates irreparably. In this vein, Mozambique continues to hold the view of a two-state Palestine and Israel coexisting peacefully in accordance with the United Nations Security Council and General Assembly relevant resolutions. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, je vous...
President, I thank you for convening this meeting. And I thank you, Martin Griffiths and Ms. Brands-Kerris, for your briefings. Your analysis of the situation is unequivocal. The guns must fall silent if we want to stop the conflict from spreading, and if we want to stop the civilian population from suffering, and if we want to facilitate humanitarian access and the release of hostages. This is why Switzerland is calling to take all measures to immediately allow safe, unhindered, and expanded humanitarian access and to establish a sustained humanitarian ceasefire. The unjustifiable acts of terror committed by Hamas on the 7th of October, the number of victims, nearly 1,200, the violence, particularly sexual violence, suffered by many young women and girls, as well as the hostage-taking, were deeply shocking. We have firmly and unequivocally condemned them. We reiterate our call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages still held in Gaza. We continue to attach great importance to the right of each state to ensure its own security and the duty to protect its population and that under its control. Since that day, we have witnessed an alarming increase in the level of violence and suffering in the Middle East. In Gaza, more than 23,400 people have been killed and more than 59,600 injured, according to OCHA. 3 months later, there is no end in sight. It is our responsibility as members of this Council, responsible for ensuring international peace and security, to reverse this trend. The continuation of this violence not only threatens to destabilize the entire region, but also jeopardizes the very foundations of the international system based on law and the fundamental principles of humanity. In 3 months, the Gaza Strip has become uninhabitable, and, in the words of the Secretary General, no one is safe there. As we speak, 85% of the population of Gaza, including many families with children, have been forced to flee. 1.4 million people are now crammed into 155 overcrowded and inadequately equipped UNRWA structures. Therefore, Switzerland rejects and condemns all statements aimed at expelling civilians from the occupied Palestinian territory, including from Gaza. Switzerland recalls that the Geneva Conventions prohibit the forced transfer of populations, which can constitute war crimes. We call on the leaders of all parties to refrain from any unilateral measures, provocative acts, or inflammatory statements, in particular those that may constitute a violation of international law. It is urgent to negotiate a decisive turning point out of this crisis, which threatens the peace and security of Israelis, Palestinians, the entire region, and far beyond. To this end, the full implementation of Council Resolutions 2712 and 2720 is essential. There is an urgent need to increase the flow of international aid into Gaza by ensuring rapid, safe, and unhindered access in accordance with international humanitarian law. The status quo is untenable for civilians. They are under serious threat from the continuing intense hostilities and the shortage of all goods and services essential to their survival, causing famine, which is already affecting 500,000 Gazans. In this regard, Switzerland recalls that the use of starvation as a method of warfare is strictly prohibited by international humanitarian law and may constitute a war crime. In addition, all violations of international law committed in Israel and throughout the occupied Palestinian territory must be investigated and the perpetrators brought to justice before the relevant bodies. To this end, the International Criminal Court is currently conducting an investigation into the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, covering both the events of the 7th of October and those currently taking place in Gaza and the West Bank. President, the search for a two-state political solutions, which this Council has advocated for years, is imperative. The conditions must be prepared to rebuild Gaza as an integral part of a future Palestinian state living side by side with Israel in peace within secure and recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for that statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of France. I thank Mr. Griffiths and Ms. Brans-Keris for their briefings. As has been stated by the President of the Republic, Emmanuel Macron, we must strive immediately to bring about a lasting ceasefire with the assistance of all regional and international partners. It is vital to do that to facilitate the delivery of more humanitarian aid to the civilians in Gaza. We must remove obstacles to guaranteeing humanitarian access and to allow the full implementation of Resolutions 2712 and 2720. France will continue to provide humanitarian, financial and material aid to benefit the civilian population in the Gaza Strip. We welcome the work of UNRWA and of all humanitarian personnel. France calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. This Council must condemn the attacks perpetrated by Hamas and other terrorist groups on the 7th of October, including sexual violence. France will continue its work to impose sanctions against Hamas at a European level. On a political level, France will continue to call for the two-state solution, with both states having Jerusalem as their capital. That is the only solution which will make it possible to bring about a just and lasting peace. The President of the Republic is continuing his discussions with the stakeholders in the region to achieve that goal. We must work to build a state for the Palestinian people. The Palestinian Authority has a pivotal role to play in that process in the West Bank and in Gaza, which is destined to become part of that Palestinian state. This Council recalled in its resolution 2712 that the forced displacement of civilians was counter to international law. Moreover, France condemns the policy of settlement that is illegal and is a major impediment to the two-state solution. It is vital to put an end to settler violence in the West Bank. Finally, it is of the utmost importance to avoid a regional conflagration. Ensuring stability in Lebanon and the region requires absolute adherence to Resolution 1701 by all parties. France staunchly condemns the Houthi attacks against commercial vessels in the Red Sea. These undermine navigational rights and freedoms. We will continue to shoulder our responsibilities to contribute to maritime security in the region. I thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the Permanent Observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, أود بداية أن أعبر.
At the outset, I would like to express our thanks to our fraternal country, Algeria, for calling for this meeting.
To thank the briefers, USG Mr. Griffith and ASG Ms. Karras, for their statements, but more importantly, for the relentless efforts of the United Nations to uphold its mandate in circumstances made deliberately impossible. Allow me also, before delivering my statement, to make two remarks. First, we thank South Africa for its moral leadership with the case it presented before the ICJ yesterday against Israel for genocide. We advise those who were unable until now to even say that Israel has committed grave breaches of international law, let alone hold Israel accountable, to avoid claiming some legal or moral authority to criticize South Africa for seizing the highest judicial body of our international law-based order to address one of the most important situations of our time. The lesson of the Holocaust is not that you should defend Israel when it is committing atrocities, but rather that one should stand against atrocities regardless of who commit them and who endure them. Second, the best way to avoid regional escalation is not the threat or use of more fire, but action for an immediate ceasefire. I have to say, one would have hoped that saving Palestinian children's lives would be met with the same urgency to act and to provide protection granted to shipping lanes. Mr. President, it took 75 years for the United Nations to finally recognize the Nakba. Instead of seeing the Nakba end, our people are yet again confronted with large-scale massacres aimed at forcibly displacing them. This is a Nakba that the world is watching unfold before our eyes. I am from the generation born with the Nakba, with its massacres, its tents and its hardships. I never thought I would see it happen again in my lifetime. 70% of Palestinians in Gaza are already refugees who were denied their right of return for decades now. Many of the people in Gaza have had their homes destroyed in previous assaults. Palestinians in Gaza today mourn their loved ones and mourn their homes that they built and rebuilt for themselves and their families. They mourn their city. They mourn the Gaza Strip as all its landmarks have been destroyed. Every place people had happy memories, it has been disfigured. Now, every corner is filled with agony and death and suffering. In 100 days, virtually every Palestinian in Gaza has been displaced multiple times, from a home to a UN shelter to a tent, searching for safety everywhere, finding safety nowhere, searching for life anywhere, met by death everywhere. Israel has deliberately destroyed everything. It killed and maimed our children, our doctors, our journalists, our engineers, our poets, our academics. It destroyed the very requirement of life and of a life in Gaza. No homes to live in, no schools or universities to study, no hospitals to heal, no mosques or churches to worship, no agricultural land to farm, no bakeries for bread, no drinkable water, no markets to buy from, no safety, no future, and as Mr. Griffith said correctly, no safe place in the Gaza Strip. It was hoping Palestinians would leave under the pressure of its bombardments. They have not. Now it is hoping they will leave because of the destruction the bombs have left behind. Palestinians are traumatized by the Nakba. They have laid even deeper roots in the hope of preventing it from reoccurring. But it is unjust that their lives should be hell on earth just because they refuse to leave their homeland. Our people have a simple dream: to live in freedom and dignity on their land. This is their right, and yet they keep being stripped away from it for decades now. Mr. President, the Secretary General was unequivocal in his report and his statements, together with the entirety of the UN system. Saving civilian lives, allowing humanitarian access and aid, preventing famine, and stopping the spread of infectious diseases, and preventing regional escalation all require an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. You cannot do any of these things without immediate ceasefire. If you want to send humanitarian assistance up to scale, if you want to prevent the forced displacement, if you want an army of humanitarian officers from the United Nations to be able to deliver humanitarian assistance to every corner in the Gaza Strip, you cannot do it without a ceasefire. The SG is correct, Mr. Griffith is correct, and all those who believe in that are correct. And we thank you for the unanimous decision or position of rejecting forced displacement. We acknowledge that. We appreciate that. And we thank you also for the unanimous position of asking for humanitarian aid to be up to scale as the SG requested. And we thank you for that. What you are not unanimously agreeing to is the requirement to do it, the guarantee to do it, which is calling for a ceasefire and for a ceasefire now. And we hope that soon that you will become unanimous in that decision to call for a ceasefire. Instead, mass killings of Palestinians by Israel continue. Death is everywhere. Now it has new shapes, new names, as starvations, dehydration, disease are spreading like wildfire. This is not a consequence of a war, but an Israeli-made humanitarian catastrophe. Israeli confession or denials are irrelevant. Their actions speak louder enough, and action speaks louder than words. Israel wants the Palestinian people to choose between destruction and displacement, between genocide and ethnic cleansing. You need to act now to stop the genocide underway, to save lives, to put an end to this carnage and to restore life in Gaza. And our people will have to figure out how to live with such loss, pain, suffering, and trauma, with how to live without their loved ones, or without limbs, or with visible and invisible scars. Mr. President, there has always been two visions about how to end this conflict. Live and let live, uphold international law, end the occupation, fulfill Palestinian rights, and achieve just and lasting peace based on UN resolutions. That is the international consensus. And another vision, a supremacist, racist, criminal, and delusional vision that somehow this conflict could end by Palestinians accepting that they have only three options: death, exodus, or subjugation. This incessant attacks against Palestinian communities in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, to force them to leave also stem from that same logic, the one that denies Palestinian existence, Palestinian rights, and Palestinian statehood, the one that considers that the solution is not ending the Nakba, but taking it to its term. The international position is clear. There is not a people too many in our region. There is a missing independent state. Act accordingly, protect the Palestinian people, and support the independence of the Palestinian state. Mr. President, the Palestinian people are here to stay. We are as old as our Roman olive trees. They have a right to live in freedom and dignity in their ancestral land. This is the only path towards shared peace and security. All those who want to see shared peace and security should not spread fire. They must support an immediate ceasefire and support it right now. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished council members, this is the second Security Council meeting this week on the situation in Gaza, and the 21st meeting on the subject since October 7th. Over the same period, 3 General Assembly sessions were convened, 2 Security Council resolutions were adopted, as well as 2 General Assembly resolutions. Sadly, not a single one of these resolutions condemned Hamas for their heinous massacre of 1,300 Israelis and for taking 240 hostages. Nearly 100 days have passed. Nearly 100 days of 136 children, women, and elderly being held in dark Hamas terror tunnels. And still, not a single discussion here was dedicated to advance their release. Not even one. 100 days, for heaven's sake, 100 days, and not once has this council convened in order to focus on freeing the hostages. Little baby Kfir Bibas is about to mark his first birthday. A quarter of his life spent as a hostage in the hands of rapists and murderers. And the council has taken no action to secure his release. 100 days, and Hamas has not even permitted the Red Cross to visit the hostages. This is the most heinous war crime. And what has this council done? But colleagues, these are all symptoms of the same cancer that is rotting this institution. For years, the United Nations has been exploited by dictators and human rights abusers, and today it has become another weapon in the arsenal of terrorists. The UN has lost all moral credibility. 98 days after the most widespread massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, it has become evidently clear that the United Nations can only unite on one thing: the demonization of Israel. 76 years ago, here at the UN, there was a moment of justice and morality when the General Assembly adopted the partition plan, establishing a Jewish state, establishing an Arab state. Israel, as you probably remember, immediately accepted the resolution and established a thriving state, democracy. The Palestinians, on the other hand, rejected the resolution, and from that moment on, for the past 76 years, they have used every means to annihilate us, including the use of the UN as a weapon. They called their failure to commit a genocide against the Jewish people the Nakba. You heard it today. Council members, there is not one single UN body that has remained untainted by politicized anti-Israel bias. Every UN body has become weaponized against Israel by the Palestinians and their automatic anti-Israel majority. Just look at this meeting. The Arab League representative on the Council found it crucial to discuss the forced displacement of Gazans in the same week that Gaza was already discussed here in depth and in the General Assembly. First, let me be very clear. There is no forced displacement. As Israel's Prime Minister said 2 days ago, Israel has no intention of displacing the population in Gaza. Israel is solely fighting Hamas terrorists, whose core strategy is to use Gazan civilians as human shields and who have converted every inch of Gaza to a terror war machine. To ensure that October 7th never happens again, Israel must eliminate Hamas. You all know it. Yet, Hamas has embedded itself in and under civilian infrastructure. There is hardly one home in Gaza that weapons were not found. So, in order to mitigate civilian casualties, Israel requested the temporary evacuation of civilians from active war zones. After all, temporary evacuation is reversible, while the loss of life is not. You know the facts, yet, due to political interests, some of you prefer spreading falsehoods over the truth. Israel be damned. Colleagues, as we speak, there are over 1 million Muslims being forcibly removed from their homes. All of their possessions taken from them as they face poverty, famine, and disease. No, I'm not talking about the situation in Gaza, but about Pakistan's forced displacement of 1.3 million Afghans. Afghan families that lived their entire lives in Pakistan are being forcefully expelled, their lives destroyed and their future lost. 85% of those fleeing are women and children, 85%. This council convened 21 times primarily to assist the people of Gaza at the account of Israel defending itself against Hamas terrorists, but not even once to focus solely on defending the rights of Afghans in Pakistan. Why does the forced displacement of Muslims from a Muslim country mean nothing to the Algerian representative and the council? I'll tell you why. No Jews, no news. But this is merely one example. On Christmas, 200 Nigerian Christians were murdered by Muslims. Over the past decade, 50,000 Christians in Nigeria have been butchered and hacked to death. Is this even a concern to the Council? Again, no Jews, no news. Colleagues, this Council speaks a lot about proportionality. But where is the proportionality when it comes to your obsession against Israel? You dedicate hours talking about Israel and attempting to tie our hands when brutal dictatorships and murderous regimes such as Iran and others are hardly a focus here. Sadly, you are not the captains of this ship. The Council is being led by the poisonous political goals of the biased majority in the UN. Every UN body is now a weapon against Israel, and as a result, those in real need remain helpless. By focusing mainly on Israel, a country that represents 0.1% of the global population, every human rights abuser can continue their crimes unimpeded. Colleagues, in 2023, the General Assembly passed more resolutions against Israel than against Iran, North Korea, and Syria combined. Iran, a country that murders women for not properly wearing their head coverings, guns down peaceful protesters, thousands, and hangs members of the LGBTQ community from cranes while funding terror across the globe, had only one GA resolution passed against it, while its leaders are given the red carpet treatment here at the UN. Syria, a country that has murdered hundreds of thousands of its own citizens with barrel bombs and chemical weapons, also had only one resolution passed against it. Israel had over a dozen, just like every year. It should be crystal clear to every person in this room that the UN is not only broken, it is dangerous. It took UN women 60 days to release a loose and vague statement on Hamas's sexual violence despite the overwhelming evidence of their crimes. To the UN, Israeli women are not women. Under-Secretary General Griffith libelously said recently that Gaza is the worst humanitarian crisis, the worst he has ever seen. Really? He saw the killing field of Khmer Rouge. He saw 400,000 Yemenis murdered and starved to death. But to him, Gaza is worse. Every single day, Israel facilitates truckloads of food, water, and medical supplies to Gaza and supports every humanitarian initiative, while OCHA refuses to even report about Israeli victims of terror. Where are his concerns? By the way, where are your concerns of Palestinian leaders, Palestinian officials' incitement to terrorism? They pay the terrorists. They don't only talk about it, they pay them to kill Jews. The PA did not even condemn the October 7th massacre. Where are the concerns? Even the WHO has joined the Palestinians' arsenal. In May, at the WHO annual meeting, a special debate was held to single out Israel, the only country in the world singled out for condemnation with its very own special agenda item was the Jewish state. At that same annual meeting, North Korea was elected to the WHO board, upon which Syria and Yemen also sit. This is how distorted the UN has become. The same goes for UNRWA. Just this week, a Telegram group of 3,000 UNRWA teachers in Gaza was exposed to contain many posts celebrating and praising Hamas's massacre. The rapist murderers were praised as heroes. Their education was glorified, and pictures of dead and captured Israelis were gleefully shared. Countless weapons caches and rockets have been found in UNRWA schools across Gaza, as well as sickening education materials promoting martyrdom and anti-Semitism. This is a UN agency manufacturing generations of hate and violence. It is literally a UN-facilitated weapon against Israel. The list of different UN agencies and bodies that have been weaponized against Israel is endless. But of all the anti-Israel organs at the UN, there is one that puts all others to shame, and this is the Human Rights Council. Currently, important to know the facts, out of the Council's 47 members, only 17 actually uphold human rights in their own countries. And this is the Council we trust to be a lighthouse of morality and good. Not a single Human Rights Council resolution has been focused on the police state of Cuba, not even once, or the authoritarian regime of Venezuela. No Jews, no news. Iran even recently chaired a human rights social forum. To the UN, darkness is light and wrong is right. Israel is the only country that is bashed at every Human Rights Council session due to Special Agenda Item 7, bash the Jews and make news. Like in the General Assembly, Israel has more resolutions passed against it at the Human Rights Council than any other country by a long shot. 1/3 of all commissions of inquiry ever established by the Council have been, guess against who, have been to investigate Israel, the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. You're invited to visit, even though you don't want to. Colleagues, just when Israel thought that the UN had hit rock bottom, this organization proved us wrong. South Africa's libelous case at the ICJ is the epitome of the UN's dystopian reality. How can it be that the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide, adopted following the genocide of the Jewish people, is now being weaponized against the Jewish state while serving the Hamas terrorists that perpetrated the massacre? Anyone who looks at the facts on the ground can see that South Africa's case is baseless. Hamas is the one that declares publicly and seeks to commit genocide against Israelis, not the other way around. The body that should truly be sitting on trial is the UN. The UN is an accomplice of terrorists. The UN has turned a blind eye to Hamas's digging of terror tunnels for 18 years under schools and Hamas's exploitation of international aid to fund their terror war machine. Mr. President, Israel is fighting the most just war. Israel was attacked unprovoked by Hamas ISIS terrorists whose stated goal is to annihilate us. It is written in their charter, and they have sworn to publicly to repeat the atrocities of October 7th until they achieve this goal. No country, dear colleagues, in the world would accept a ceasefire in a similar situation until such a threat can no longer be actualized. You all know this. So why are you still being steered by politics? Why are you directly following the script of terrorists? Do you not bother to think what will happen if in Israel and Gaza, if there is a ceasefire? We know what will happen. Hamas will continue its reign of terror in Gaza. How can you speak about the two-state solution or any other solution together with a ceasefire that will keep Hamas in power? What kind of future do you think the region will have if this happens? Hamas knows that it cannot defeat Israel on the conventional battlefield. So instead, it uses terror to attempt to drive us away out of fear while weaponizing the UN to help it achieve its goal. The time has come to take back the UN, to force this institution to live up to its founding principles. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie le représentant d'Israël de sa déclaration. Le représentant de l'Algérie a demandé la parole pour faire une autre déclaration.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, de me donner la parole pour la seconde fois. Rassurez-vous, je vais être bref, mais je vais essayer de vous aider à conclure cette session de notre Conseil sur une note positive. D'abord, je voudrais remercier tous mes collègues au Conseil de sécurité pour leur contribution substantielle sur le sujet qui nous réunit aujourd'hui, c'est-à-dire le projet de déplacement forcé de la population palestinienne. Au terme de nos échanges de cet après-midi, l'on peut conclure qu'il y a un consensus au sein du Conseil de sécurité autour du rejet catégorique de tout projet visant directement ou indirectement le déplacement forcé des Palestiniens de leurs terres. C'est un consensus rare, c'est un consensus précieux qui nous réconcilie avec le multilatéralisme. Ne pourrions-nous pas avancer ensemble sur la base de ce consensus retrouvé au sein du Conseil, même s'il ne concerne qu'une partie de la question palestinienne? Cela aurait, j'en suis certain, une résonance extraordinaire au sein de l'opinion publique dans le monde et surtout dans notre région. Dans notre région où, je dois l'avouer, les Nations Unies et le Conseil de sécurité ont besoin de reconquérir leur crédibilité et la confiance dans leur action. La délégation algérienne est disposée à travailler avec tous les collègues au sein du Conseil de sécurité pour avancer dans ce sens, pour la paix dans notre région, mais aussi dans le monde. Je vous remercie.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Algérie de sa déclaration. Il n'y a plus d'oratrices ou d'orateurs inscrits sur la liste. La séance est levée. La 9532e séance du Conseil de sécurité est ouverte. L'ordre du jour provisoire de la présente séance est maintien de la paix et de la sécurité internationale. L'ordre du jour est adopté. Conformément à l'article 39 du règlement intérieur provisoire du Conseil, j'invite M. Khaled Kiari, sous-secrétaire général pour le Moyen-Orient, l'Asie et le Pacifique au département des affaires politiques et de la consolidation de la paix, à participer à la présente séance. Il en est ainsi décidé. Le Conseil de sécurité va maintenant aborder l'examen du point 2 de l'ordre du jour. Je donne à présent la parole à M. Khaled Kiari.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. On 11 January, the military forces of the United States and the United Kingdom, supported by 4 countries, reportedly conducted over 50 air strikes and missile strikes on targets across Yemen, including in Sana'a, Taiz, Hudaydah, Hajjah, Saada, Damar, and Ib. According to the Houthis, this resulted in 5 dead and 6 wounded fighters. The United Nations cannot independently verify these figures at this time. As of this afternoon, no UN staff or premises were reported as having been affected. Yesterday's strike followed the continued Houthi targeting of vessels in the Red Sea, including what was reported as the largest attack to date on 9 January, which involved a combination of drones and missiles that were intercepted by the United States and the United Kingdom naval forces. Subsequent to the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2722 on 10th of January, the Houthis reportedly launched another attack using an anti-ship ballistic missile on 11 January. The former attack was claimed by the Houthis to be a preliminary retaliation for the killing of Houthis fighters by US naval forces in an incident reported on 31st of December. Mr. President, we are witnessing a cycle of violence that risks grave political, security, economic, and humanitarian repercussions in Yemen and the region. Recent humanitarian improvements in the country are fragile and could easily be reversed if there are further incidents, while progress on reaching a political settlement to end the war in Yemen could also be undermined, leaving the people of Yemen facing the impact of continued conflict. These developments in the Red Sea and the risk of exacerbating regional tensions are alarming. The Houthis' attack following the adoption of Security Council resolution and yesterday's events further demonstrates that the region is on a dangerous escalatory trajectory which could potentially impact millions in Yemen, the region, and globally. In a statement issued today, the Secretary General called upon all parties involved not to escalate even more the situation in the interest of peace and stability in the Red Sea and the wider region. All concerned parties must do their utmost to avoid further escalation, reduce tensions, and exercise restraint. We also reaffirm the importance of ensuring the safety and security of maritime navigation in the region, as emphasized in the Resolution 2722 of this Council. In that regard, we also call for the immediate release of the Galaxy Leader, which was seized by the Houthis on 19 November, and the release of her crew. Monsieur le Président, we call on this Council to continue its efforts in actively engaging with all concerned parties to prevent further escalation from exacerbating regional tensions or undermining regional peace, security, or international trade. Je vous remercie.
Je remercie M. Kiari pour son exposé et je donne maintenant la parole aux membres du Conseil qui souhaitent faire une déclaration, à commencer par le représentant de la Fédération de Russie.
Господин председатель, признательны Халиду Керри за его доклад о ситуации. Вообще-то в условиях очевидной вооруженной агрессии по отношению к суверенной стране в качестве докладчика мы бы сегодня хотели видеть генерального секретаря ООН. мы хотели увидеть в качестве докладчика генерального секретаря ООН. Главная задача Организации Объединенных Наций, закрепленного в ее уставе, предотвращать угрозы миру и подавлять акты агрессии или других нарушений мира в соответствии с принципами международного права. С большим сожалением констатируем, что вчера мы столкнулись именно с такой ситуацией. Вооруженная агрессия со стороны группы стран против другого государства. 11 января так называемая международная коалиция во главе с Соединенными Штатами и Великобританией, куда вошли Австралия, Канада, Бахрейн и, как они сами себя величают, столица мирового правосудия Нидерланды, нанесла массированные удары по территории Йемена. Речь идет не об атаке на какую-то группу в стране, а о нападении на народ этой страны в целом. Были задействованы авиация, военные корабли и подводные лодки. Сообщается, что с бортов ВМС США проведены также пуски ракет «Томагавк». Под удары попали йеменский порт Ходейда, город Сана, Саада, Забит, Таис и Дамар. Американцы и их сателлиты бомбили аэропорты и другую инфраструктуру. На месте воронок от взрывов полыхают пожары. То, что мы наблюдаем в Йемене, к сожалению, нам знакомо до боли. Точно такая же картина разрушений уже 3 месяца наблюдается в секторе Газа. Теперь многострадальный Йемен снова стал очагом боевых действий в регионе. Война распространяется на Красное море и Аденский залив. При этом Вашингтон явно не собирается останавливаться на достигнутом. В Белом доме заявили, что оставляет за собой право возобновить военные действия в случае, если усмотрят новые угрозы. Не нужно быть прозорливым, чтобы понимать, и эти угрозы, и меры по реагированию на них Соединенные Штаты будут определять произвольно, без малейшей оглядки на международное право. Господин председатель, вопреки утверждениям западных коллег, массированные удары Соединенных Штатов и Великобритании по территории Йемена не имеют ничего общего с осуществлением права на самооборону по статье 51 Устава ООН. Статья 51 неприменима к ситуации с коммерческими судами. Право на самооборону не может задействоваться для обеспечения свободы судоходства. Нашим американским коллегам это прекрасно известно. При этом никакой санкции Совета Безопасности по главе 7 Устава на применение силы тоже не было. Коллеги, ситуация предельно ясна. Действия так называемой коалиции – грубейшее нарушение статьи 2 Устава ООН. Это очередная военная агрессия коллективного Запада в длинном списке его набегов на настрадавшийся Ближний Восток. Все псевдоправовые обоснования Белого дома не выдерживают никакой критики. Хочу еще раз напомнить, что свобода судоходства регулируется Конвенцией ООН по морскому праву 1982 года. В случае нарушения Конвенция позволяет начать с нарушителем переговоры и подать иск в арбитраж или Международный трибунал по морскому праву. Ничто в этом документе, как и в нормах международного морского обычного права, не дает права атаковать суверенную страну. В глаза бросается и то, что, пытаясь подыскать хоть какое-то оправдание своим нелегитимным действиям, в Вашингтоне путаются в показаниях. Чего стоит абсолютно нелепое с правовой точки зрения упоминание в заявлении президента Соединенных Штатов пиратства. Это понятно любому, кто хотя бы раз видел определение пиратства в статье 101 упомянутой конвенции. Но даже если речь шла о пиратах, конвенция дает право задержать пиратское судно и судить экипаж, а не вбамбливать очередную страну в каменный век. Господин председатель, Россия неоднократно предупреждала о рисках подобного развития событий. Мы последовательно призывали к прекращению огня в секторе Газа, в том числе в целях предотвращения дальнейшей региональной эскалации и втягивания соседних стран, пусть и опосредованно, в палестино-израильский конфликт на фоне беспрецедентной по своей жестокости военной операции Израиля в анклаве. Но все попытки Совета Безопасности ООН принять решение с требованием о прекращении насилия были заблокированы Соединенными Штатами. Раз за разом, вместо того, чтобы обратиться к устранению коренных причин нестабильности, сделать ставку на политическое решение проблем, Запад выбирает силу. Вместо того, чтобы принудить Израиль прекратить боевые действия в Газе, ему обеспечиваются возможности для продолжения истребления палестинских женщин и детей. В ходе голосования по американо-японскому проекту резолюции по так называемой безопасности судоходства в Красном море мы предупреждали о том, что доверять уверениям западных делегаций про их якобы благие намерения нельзя. Они изначально намеревались дать извращенное толкование расплывчатым формулировкам этого невнятного документа, чтобы попытаться придать видимость законности своим преступным действиям. Предвидя риски подобного сценария, мы предложили балансирующие поправки к тексту, которые позволили бы его избежать. К сожалению, большинство членов Совета не нашли в себе решимости их поддержать. Тем не менее, даже в текущем виде в резолюции 2722 нет ни ссылок на главу 7 Устава ООН, ни каких-либо иных авторизаций того беспредела, который Соединенные Штаты и их сателлиты творят в Йемене, чреватого полноценной войной не только в этой стране, но и в масштабах всего региона. Господин председатель, у Соединенных Штатов и их союзников длинный послужной список грубых нарушений и превратного толкования международного права. В попытке прикрыть фиговым листком свою агрессию против Сирии, американцы в свое время изобрели абсурдную концепцию, якобы допускающую коллективную самооборону с негосударственным субъектом, сирийскими курдами, от сирийской армии на сирийской же территории. Естественно, ничего общего с международным правом и уставом ООН эта концепция не имела. Действия США против Сирии с точки зрения международного права были и остаются применением силы в нарушении устава ООН, то есть военной агрессией и оккупацией. Точно так же, грубо извратив положение соответствующих резолюций Совета, коалиция НАТО уничтожила ливийское государство в 2011 году. Недавно отличилась Франция, цинично назвавшая правом на самооборону очевидно военные преступления киевской хунты, удар кассетными боеприпасами по детскому катку и новогодней елке в Белгороде. Никаких военных объектов там не было, а время и место удара, как кассетное снаряжение боеприпаса, подбиралось умышленно, чтобы увеличить количество жертв среди гражданского населения, включая женщин и детей. Бойню, которую продолжает Израиль в Газе, США и их подпевалы тоже упорно называют самообороной. Хотя Международный суд ООН в консультативном заключении от 2004 года прямо исключил возможность Израиля ссылаться на статью 51 применительно к своим действиям в отношении оккупированных палестинских территорий с учетом особенностей их статуса. Видимо, когда дело доходит до гегемонистских устремлений Вашингтона, ни международное право, ни Международный суд ООН американцам и их союзникам не указ. В этом и есть вся суть продвигаемого Соединенными Штатами и другими западными странами миропорядка, основанного на правилах. Господин председатель, на Ближнем Востоке складывается критическая ситуация. Дело уже даже не в том, что своими действиями западники разрушают результаты многолетних усилий ООНовского регионального посредничества по внутриеменскому регулированию. Проблема гораздо шире. Такие опрометчивые и недальновидные шаги дестабилизируют ситуацию с безопасностью и подрывают наметившуюся нормализацию общерегиональной обстановки. Если эскалация продолжится, то весь регион Ближнего Востока может столкнуться с катастрофой, по сравнению с которой все происходящее до этого покажется цветочками. Потерянные жизни и разрушенные судьбы людей будет не сосчитать. И вся полнота ответственности за это ляжет на США и их пособников, которые ради своих корыстных геополитических интересов не просто упорно мешают международному сообществу потребовать прекращения огня в секторе Газа, но и сами в очередной раз стали агрессором. Призываем международное сообщество выступить с решительным осуждением предпринятого группой стран во главе с Соединенными Штатами без мандата ООН нападения на Йемен. Разделяем высказанные нашими региональными партнерами озабоченности в этой связи и призываем к активизации международных усилий в целях недопущения дальнейшей эскалации насилия на Ближнем Востоке. Благодарю вас.
Je remercie le représentant de la Fédération de Russie de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole à la représentante du Royaume-Uni.
Thank you, President. and I thank Assistant Secretary General Chiari for his briefing. The United Kingdom and this Council has consistently condemned, in the strongest terms, the illegal and unjustified attacks in the Red Sea by the Houthi militants. On the 9th of January, the Houthis attacked UK and US naval vessels. Last night, we took limited, necessary, and proportionate action in self-defense alongside the United States, with the non-operational support of the Netherlands, Canada, Bahrain, and Australia. The United Kingdom's Royal Air Force carried out targeted strikes against military facilities used by Houthi rebels in Yemen. This operation took particular care to minimize risks to civilians. Since November, the Houthis have launched over 100 drone and missile attacks against vessels from a range of countries, putting innocent lives at risk, threatening the global economy, and destabilizing the region. This has continued despite this Council's demand in Resolution 2722, adopted earlier this week, that the Houthis immediately cease all such attacks. Let me be clear. The attacks by Houthis on vessels in the Red Sea must stop. We have made this clear to the Houthis, and we call on them to de-escalate. The United Kingdom is committed to continue working with the international community and this Council to combat this international threat. We have published a summary of our legal position on last night's strikes and have reported to the Council in writing in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. President, we remain committed to ensuring freedom of navigation, which is protected by international law, and to defend international trade. It is in all our interests to work together to de-escalate tensions in the region. Thank you, President.
Je remercie la représentante du Royaume-Uni de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole à la représentante des États-Unis.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Assistant Secretary General Chiari, for your briefing. Colleagues, as you heard last night, in response to ongoing and escalating Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, the United States and United Kingdom, with support from Australia, Bahrain, Canada, and the Netherlands, conducted a number of joint strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen. The aim of these strikes was to disrupt and degrade the Houthis' ability to continue their reckless attacks against vessels and commercial shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. These strikes were necessary and they were proportionate, as you just heard from my UK colleague. They were consistent with international law and an exercise of the United States' inherent right to self-defense, as reflected by Article 51 of the UN Charter. And they were taken only after non-military options proved inadequate to address the threat. Still, any strike of this nature is a decision the United States does not take lightly. And so I'd like to walk us through how we reached this moment and discuss the steps that we all must take going forward to de-escalate this situation while upholding navigational rights and freedoms. Because while this coordinated response follows the Houthis' largest, most complex, and most recent attacks earlier this week, the fact is that the Houthis' opportunistic attacks on vessels have been escalating since November. And colleagues, no one in this room is immune from the effects of these attacks, not even Russia, no one. Whether your ship flies an American flag or the flag of another nation, whether you voted for this week's resolution or you abstained from it, so long as any one of our ships are vulnerable, all of our ships are vulnerable. Since November 2000 ships have been forced to divert thousands of miles to avoid the Red Sea. More than 50 nations have been affected in 27 Houthi attacks on international commercial shipping. And Houthi militants have threatened or taken hostage mariners from more than 20 countries. That includes the crew of the Galaxy Leader, a Bahamas-flagged Japanese-operated vessel. On November 19th, Houthi forces hijacked the ship and kidnapped a multinational crew, including Bulgarian, Mexican, Romanian, Ukrainian, and Filipino citizens. Despite council calls for the release of the ship and its crew, the Houthis still hold them hostage to this day. Not long after, following the council's condemnation of these attacks, a Norwegian-flagged vessel was struck by what appeared to be an anti-ship missile launched from a Houthi-controlled area of Yemen. Days later, Houthi forces attempted to board a Marshall Islands flagged vessel, while a pair of missiles were once again launched from Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. And so on December 18th, the United States established Operation Prosperity Guardian, a 22-country-strong defensive coalition to help defend against Houthi threats in the Red Sea. On December 19th, 1 month after the Houthis first took MV Galaxy Leader and its crew hostage, 44 countries condemned Houthi interference with navigational rights and freedoms in the Red Sea. Unfortunately, the Houthis continued their attacks. On December 26, the United States forces intercepted 12 one-way attack drones, 3 anti-ship cruise missiles, and 2 land attack cruise missiles in the southern Red Sea, all fired by the Houthis at multiple vessels crossing the waterway. Aiming to deter further attacks and de-escalate the situation, the United States put forward a presidential statement, one that received strong support, save unfortunately for one member of this council. As we deliberated further on December 30th and 31st, the attacks escalated when Houthis targeted and then attempted to commandeer a Singapore-flagged and Denmark-owned and operated ship. When Houthi attackers ignored warnings and fired on our naval helicopters, the United States responded by striking and sinking 3 of their 4 boats. And while the United States sought to defend commercial ships in the Red Sea, we also continued to pursue a diplomatic response. On January 3rd, the United States, along with 13 other countries representing some of the world's largest shippers, warned that the Houthis' attacks threaten innocent lives, the global economy, and the free flow of commerce, noting that the Houthis would bear the full consequences should they continue these attacks. That same day, this council convened an emergency meeting where there was a consensus for council action. And so in partnership with Japan, we penned a resolution that was adopted earlier this week following extensive consultations. This resolution once again called for the Houthis to cease these attacks and condemn those who provided the arms and assistance needed to carry them out. I'll also note that this resolution referenced the inherent right of member states in accordance with international law to defend their vessels from attacks. The inherent right. So why take you through this timeline? Because doing so makes this much exceedingly clear. Yesterday's strike was the latest in a series of actions in self-defense taken by the United States alongside other countries, and one that occurred against a broad diplomatic backdrop of global condemnation. Colleagues, the United States does not desire more conflict in a region already plagued by so much of it. Our aim is simple: to de-escalate tensions and restore stability in the Red Sea while upholding the fundamental principles of freedom of navigation. In order to do that, this Council must continue to do a few things. We must continue to make clear that despite bad faith claims to the contrary, most of the vessels the Houthis have attacked have nothing to do with Israel. And it goes without saying, attacks on any vessel in the Red Sea, regardless of our origin or ownership, are entirely unacceptable. Arguing otherwise risks legitimizing clear violations of international law. We need to also be clear about the role of Iran in these attacks. Without Iranian support, in violation of their obligations under Resolution 2216, the Houthis would struggle to effectively track and strike commercial vessels navigating shipping lanes through the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Every member of this Council, and especially those with direct channels to Iran, should press Iran's leaders to rein in the Houthis and stop these attacks. Finally, this Council itself must continue to demand that the Houthis cease their attacks and release the mariners and ship it continues to hold hostage. We must continue to uphold the free flow of commerce in one of the world's most critical waterways in accordance with international law. That was the charge before us when we first convened on this issue in December. It was the charge before us when we convened earlier this week, and that is the urgent charge before us today. Thank you.
Je remercie la représentante des États-Unis de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la Slovénie.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I myself want to thank Assistant Secretary Chiari for his briefing this afternoon. I have three simple messages regarding the developments overnight. First, we condemn Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, which must immediately cease. This we made clear through the adoption of Resolution 2722 only 2 days ago. Freedom of navigation and maritime security are critically important for Slovenia. What is also clear is that any action to defend vessels from attacks must be undertaken in full compliance with the international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. This means that principles of distinction, necessity, proportionality, and precaution should be upheld at all times. Second, the people of Yemen have suffered greatly through years of conflict, and they deserve sustainable peace. Since April 22, they have benefited from a truce which is broadly holding. It is regrettable that we have reached this point. Our sincere hope is that critical progress on UN-mediated peace talks can continue. And thirdly, it is in no one's interest to have a further dangerous escalation in the Middle East. We worry that these recent developments introduce a new dynamic to the region that has a potential to further complicate an already heated situation. We call for a de-escalation of tensions, and we urge restraint by the Houthis. We stand ready to engage on a comprehensive response to the crisis currently engulfing the region. A joint effort by a united Security Council is needed to avoid crashing into the abyss. Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Slovénie de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la Chine.
谢谢主席先生。主席先生，中方感谢俄罗斯倡议举行此次紧急会议，感谢 基亚利助理秘书长刚才所做的通报。美国、英国等国对也门境内目标实施空袭，使红海地区紧张局势进一步升级。中方对此表示严重关切。红海水域是重要的货物和能源运输通道。一段时间以来，胡塞武装在红海水域多次袭击和扣押商船，干扰国际贸易秩序，不利于地区稳定。中方多次呼吁胡塞武装立即停止袭扰商船的行为，尊重各国商船根据国际法在红海水域的航行权利。中方同时呼吁各方，特别是有影响力的大国，发挥建设性、负责任作用，共同维护红海水域航道安全。我们遗憾地看到，有关国家对也门悍然采取的军事行动，不仅造成基础设施破坏和平民伤亡，也加剧了红海水域的安全风险，无助于保护商船安全和航行自由。有关军事行动还可能冲击也门政治进程。我们看不出这样的军事行动如何能够实现所宣称的预期目标。必须指出，安理会从未授权任何国家对也门使用武力。有关国家采取的军事行动，同安理会刚刚通过的第2722号决议宗旨背道而驰。中方重申，任何国家不得曲解、滥用国际法和安理会决议，在红海水域制造新的紧张局势。当前红海的紧张局势是加沙冲突外溢影响的表现之一。一边放任加沙冲突延宕，一边指望冲突不会扩大，这恐怕是一厢情愿的错觉。一边主张防止冲突外溢，一边又火上浇油，挑起军事对抗，这更是自相矛盾、不负责任的。中东地区已经处在极度危险的边缘，当前最应该避免的是鲁莽的军事冒险主义，最需要的是冷静克制，防止冲突进一步扩大。我们敦促有关各方，特别是有影响力的大国，遵守联合国宪章和国际法，坚持对话协商的正确方向，为维护红海和中东地区的和平稳定做出切实努力。谢谢主席。
Je remercie le représentant de la Chine de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de l'Équateur.
Gracias, señor presidente. Tomamos nota y agradecemos la información proporcionada por el subsecretario Chiari. Ecuador expresa su preocupación por la escalada del conflicto en estas últimas horas en el Mar Rojo y se une al llamado del secretario general a que todos los actores involucrados no agraven aún más la situación en el interés de la paz y la estabilidad en la región. Hace unos días en esta sala, mi delegación condenó los ataques terroristas perpetrados contra diversas embarcaciones comerciales en el Mar Rojo por parte de los hutíes, actos que constituyen una flagrante violación del derecho internacional y, por lo tanto, una amenaza a la paz y seguridad internacionales. Hoy el Ecuador reitera esa condena. Asimismo, Ecuador ha expresado su preocupación sobre el riesgo de que esta situación exacerbe aún más las tensiones en toda la región y por la posibilidad de que esto pudiese desestabilizar aún más la paz y seguridad internacionales. La resolución adoptada por el Consejo de Seguridad hace unos días exige el cese al fuego de los ataques husíes a las embarcaciones comerciales y ordena liberar al buque Galaxy y su tripulación de manera inmediata. Estas disposiciones son de cumplimiento obligatorio y deben utilizarse todos los medios que tiene este Consejo para su implementación de conformidad con el derecho internacional. Los ataques a embarcaciones comerciales en el Mar Rojo afectan directamente a la seguridad alimentaria y la crisis humanitaria en Yemen, además de tener impactos a escala global en las cadenas de suministros regionales y en el aumento en los precios de los bienes. Hacemos un llamado nuevamente para que el diálogo político bajo los auspicios de Naciones Unidas sea el camino hacia la paz sostenible en ese país y que ninguna acción pueda borrar lo que hasta ahora se ha podido lograr para poner fin a este conflicto que tiene como consecuencia la peor crisis humanitaria en el mundo. Gracias, presidente.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Équateur de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant du Japon.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me first express my appreciation to ASG Hiyari for his briefing. Since mid-November last year, the Houthi have been continuously attacking commercial vessels engaged in lawful maritime transit through the Red Sea. They have also illegally seized and are holding the Galaxy Leader, a vessel operated by a Japanese company, and its crews for more than 50 days. As everyone knows, these acts are flagrant violations of international law and a matter of serious concern for global maritime transportation. Such actions that jeopardize the freedom of navigation of commercial vessels and safety of crew members cannot be justified for any reason. The international community has repeatedly raised a strong voice in demanding for the immediate cessation of these attacks. This Council also issued a press statement last month and held an emergency meeting on January 3rd to express its grave concern against Houthis' irresponsible actions. On the same day, the countries concerned, including Japan, sent a clear message that the Houthis would bear the responsibility of the consequences if they continued to threaten lives, global economy, and the free flow of commerce in the region's critical waterways. The Houthis, however, have not stopped the attack against commercial vessels, have been escalating their illegal and unacceptable actions. Mr. President, only 2 days ago, Security Council adopted the Resolution 2722 demanding the Houthis to immediately cease their attacks against commercial vessels and reaffirming their navigational rights and freedoms in the Red Sea. To date, we have exerted all possible diplomatic efforts to resolve this issue. Regrettably, however, the Houthis have ignored the calls by the international community, including the unequivocal pronouncement by this Council. In response, the United States and the United Kingdom have conducted joint strikes against a number of targets in Houthis' controlled areas yesterday to degrade the Houthis' capacity to make additional threat. Japan supports the determination of the United States and the United Kingdom and relevant countries to fulfill its responsibility in ensuring the free and safe navigation of vessels. To this end, we understand that these measures are aimed at preventing the further deterioration of the situation. Japan remains firm in its commitment to not tolerate any action that would disturb the inalienable freedom of safe navigation, and will take the necessary steps to seize the Houthis' threats while continuing to closely cooperating with relevant countries. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant du Japon de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant du Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Assistant Secretary General Khaled Kiari for his briefing to the Council. Mr. President, Mozambique is deeply concerned by the recent developments in Yemen, occurring less than a day after the Council adopted Resolution 2722. While we abstained from that vote it is unfortunate that the Council's decision could be misinterpreted as sanctioning the use of force. As members of this Council, entrusted with maintaining international peace, we firmly oppose any action that undermines international security or could be misconstrued as sanctioning escalation. We are deeply worried about the potential involvement of other UN members in the escalation of the conflict and violence in the region. We believe that the employment of force at this precarious time undermines crucial ongoing diplomatic efforts to pull the region back from the brink amidst the ongoing Israel-Palestine crisis. We firmly believe that in the face of possible all-out conflict in the region, moderation and increased efforts to address the underlying cause of tensions in the region must take precedence. Mr. President, we categorically condemn any attacks that endangering commercial vessels and the safe and unhindered navigation in the Red Sea. Such actions are totally unacceptable. Mr. President, it is common knowledge that Yemen is currently facing a severe humanitarian crisis, and it is on the verge of becoming a new front in an already unstable region. This unfortunate situation in Yemen is fertile ground terrorists and extremists. We strongly advocate maximum caution and restraint by all actors in order to prevent the situation in the Red Sea worsening any further. Our mandate requires us to pursue peace rather than violence and ensure that every action we take safeguards the region from further escalation and hardship. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie le représentant du Mozambique de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole à la représentante de Malte.
Thank you, President, and thank you, ASG Chiari, for your briefing. The Middle East continues to be in a state of turmoil. The conflict in Gaza, the deteriorating situation in the West Bank, hostilities along the Blue Line, and episodes of insecurity in Syria and Iraq paint a troubling picture. The rapidly deteriorating maritime security situation in the Red Sea is an equal cause of grave concern. The Houthi attacks against commercial shipping in the Red Sea are in violation of international law. They risk the safety of seafarers and other persons and jeopardize critical flows of goods. Respecting and upholding the navigational rights and freedoms of commercial vessels in the Red Sea and the Bab al-Mandab is of paramount importance. Attacks that threaten these rights are unacceptable and must be strongly condemned. We reiterate our call on the Houthis to immediately cease any attacks and actions against commercial shipping. President, ongoing violence in the region risks fueling an unfortunate situation where military escalation would be almost inevitable. It is fundamental to avoid any further escalation, and restraint must be exercised as outlined in Resolution 2722. We also stress that international law, including international humanitarian law, must be respected at all times. A further deterioration in maritime security will have dire consequences for global trade. It will also have serious negative ramifications for the well-being of Yemen's civilian population, who heavily rely on imports for essential needs. This must be avoided at all costs. Thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de Malte de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la Suisse.
Monsieur le Président, nous remercions le sous-secrétaire général Khaled Triari pour son intervention, détaillant la succession des attaques des Houthis de ces derniers jours en mer Rouge, ainsi que les frappes militaires d'une coalition américano-britannique de la nuit dernière. Ces développements sont très préoccupants et accroissent une nouvelle fois les risques d'une escalade régionale. En décembre, les membres du Conseil ont été unanimes dans un communiqué de presse pour condamner les attaques des Houthis contre les navires en mer Rouge et demander la libération de tous les membres d'équipage du Galaxy Leader. Puis il y a tout juste 2 jours, nous avons adopté la résolution 2722, réaffirmant l'importance du strict respect des droits et libertés de navigation en mer Rouge, conformément au droit international. Dans sa déclaration après le vote, la Suisse a partagé son appréciation juridique du 3e paragraphe opérationnel. Le droit mentionné dans cet article, c'est-à-dire le droit des États membres, conformément au droit international, de défendre leurs navires contre les attaques, y compris celles qui portent atteinte aux droits et libertés de navigation, se limite stricto sensu aux mesures militaires destinées à intercepter des attaques contre les navires marchands et des navires de guerre pour protéger les dits navires et les personnes qui s'y trouvent à son bord. Dans ce contexte, toute opération militaire qui dépasse la nécessité immédiate de protéger les dits navires et les dites personnes serait disproportionnée et donc pas couverte par la résolution susmentionnée. La Suisse se montre préoccupée par les frappes militaires menées par la coalition américano-britannique. Les attaques et incidents en mer Rouge et dans la région ont des conséquences néfastes sur le trafic maritime et le commerce mondial, mais aussi sur la population civile au Yémen et dans la région. À un moment où les discussions de paix au Yémen connaissent des avancées importantes, nous devons contribuer à la préservation de ces acquis. De fait, à long terme, rien ne garantira mieux la sécurité de la mer Rouge qu'une paix durable au Yémen, incluant tous les acteurs concernés. Une nouvelle détérioration de la situation doit donc impérativement être évitée et nous avons collectivement les moyens de l'empêcher. La Suisse appelle en conséquence toutes les parties et les acteurs impliqués en mer Rouge et dans la région à la prudence et à la plus grande retenue, ainsi qu'au strict respect du droit international. Nous prenons note à cet égard de la déclaration commune de la coalition maritime, en particulier la volonté affichée d'une désescalade de la situation. En outre, le Conseil se doit d'être uni sur les questions de sécurité maritime et plus globalement dans ses décisions touchant de près ou de loin cette région et par extension le maintien de la paix et de la sécurité internationale. Il nous incombe de prévenir et non d'exacerber les tensions montantes. La Suisse s'engagera pleinement dans ce sens. Je vous remercie.
Je remercie le représentant de la Suisse de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la République de Corée.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking ASG Kyari for his timely briefing. My delegation reiterates the vital importance of assuring free and safe navigation in the Red Sea, which is a pivotal global maritime route where about 15% of global sea trade passes. Any attacks against commercial vessels are unjustifiable and unacceptable under any circumstances. Despite a series of international calls urging the Houthis to cease their attacks on merchant and commercial vessels, such attacks in the Red Sea have continued, posing threats to lives and the free flow of commerce through this critical waterway. Resolution 2722, which this Council adopted only 2 days ago, clearly references the right of the member states, in accordance with international law, to defend their vessels from attacks, including those that undermine navigational rights and freedoms. Any attempts to create fear by holding hostage the free flow of commerce in the Red Sea and to exploit the regional situation are destined to fail. Once again, we urge the Houthis to refrain from dangerous provocations and to immediately release the Galaxy Leader and its crew. At the same time, it is also imperative to prevent any further spillover from the precarious situation in the region for the protection of civilians as well as for the global economy. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie le représentant de la République de Corée de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole à la représentante du Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank you for convening this urgent meeting to receive an update from ASG Kyari on recent developments in Yemen, and we thank ASG for his briefing. We join other Council members in expressing concern about the impact of recent attacks in the Red Sea and now in Yemen, on diplomatic efforts to achieve sustainable peace in Yemen, and on efforts to contain the ongoing conflict in the region. Last week, Council members gathered in this chamber and agreed on the need to avoid any further escalation in tensions. We also acknowledged the need to avoid jeopardizing the prospects of reaching a comprehensive peace agreement in Yemen, one that would finally end a 9-year war that has killed hundreds of thousands of people and triggered one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. We listened to ASG Chiari caution about the risks of further compounding the already volatile situation in the region and expressed our support for the ongoing efforts of the Special Envoy. 1 week later, we seem to be faced with an entirely new dispensation, one where the prospects for progress and sustainable peace may be in jeopardy. Today, an estimated 18.2 million people in Yemen are still in need of humanitarian assistance. At the same time, international funding for humanitarian operations is on the decline. The Yemeni people can ill afford a re-escalation of hostilities. They deserve peace. The people of the Middle East deserve peace. Guyana calls for all sides to exercise restraint and to avoid taking any further actions that could derail ongoing efforts to find a sustainable, long-term solution to the crisis in Yemen. We therefore reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, for an end to the attacks on commercial and merchant vessels in the Red Sea, and for the release of the Galaxy Leader vessel and crew. Finally, this Council must maintain its support for the Special Envoy's efforts to negotiate a sustainable peace in Yemen. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante du Guyana de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this briefing. Let me also thank ASG Khalil Kiari for his important, informative briefing and insight. This Council on 10 January 2024 adopted Resolution 2722 to address the continued attacks on commercial vessels in the Red Sea. Sierra Leone voted in favor of the resolution in view of the principle to protect the navigational rights and freedoms by vessels of all member states and the threat posed to international peace and security, particularly in the region. In our explanation of position in the adoption of the Resolution 2722, we urge for due compliance and application of existing international law. In this regard, any action by member states that have taken place after the Security Council approved Resolution 2722 must be in line with the provisions of the resolution and existing international law. We condemn the attacks by the Houthis and urge compliance with the Council's resolution, and also call for the release of MV Galaxy Leader and its crew. Sierra Leone also reiterates the need for safeguarding the Yemeni peace process and the further need to address the root causes, including the conflict in the Gaza Strip. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Sierra Leone de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de l'Algérie.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, d'avoir convoqué cette réunion. Oh. Thank you, Mr. Chiari, for your briefing. 2 days ago, during the adoption of the resolution on maritime security, Algeria stressed that military intervention cannot ease the tensions in the Red Sea region. Algeria expresses its deep concern regarding the ongoing military operation and airstrikes in the Red Sea region, targeting various sites and cities in Yemen. Algeria calls for restraint and caution at this critical juncture to avoid further escalation. our opinion is that, first, the use of force will only complicate the situation in Yemen and may lead, unfortunately, to undermining the effort deployed by the Special Envoy of the Secretary General to end the war in Yemen and to relaunch the political process for a united Yemen with the government controlling his coastal borders and ensuring the security in the Red Sea. Second, addressing the root causes of conflicts in the region is now imperative. And in this context, the need for a ceasefire in Gaza has never been more urgent. Every day, we count more and more victims among civilians, women, and children. And only a ceasefire, an immediate and durable ceasefire, will ease the tensions in the region and avoid the spillover with catastrophic consequences in the whole region. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Algérie de sa déclaration. Je vais maintenant faire une déclaration en ma qualité de représentant de la France. Je remercie M. Chiari de sa présentation. La France condamne les attaques menées par les Houthis en mer Rouge contre des navires commerciaux. Elle se félicite de l'adoption de la résolution 2722 qui adresse un message de fermeté aux Houthis. Par leurs actions armées, les Houthis portent la responsabilité de l'escalade des tensions dans la région, ainsi que pour la stabilité internationale. Ils menacent directement 15% du commerce mondial. La France continue d'appeler à la libération immédiate du Galaxy Leader et de son équipage originaire des Philippines, de Bulgarie, d'Ukraine, de Roumanie et du Mexique, illégalement détenus par les Houthis. Nous demandons à la République islamique d'Iran, qui finance et arme les Houthis, de cesser ces actions déstabilisatrices. Par sa résolution 2722, le Conseil de sécurité a rappelé que l'exercice des droits et libertés de navigation doit être respecté et que les États ont, en accord avec le droit international, le droit de réagir à ces attaques. La France continuera à assumer ses responsabilités et à contribuer à la sûreté maritime dans cette zone, en lien avec ses partenaires, comme elle a été appelée à le faire les 9 et 11 décembre dernier, lorsque la frégate Languedoc a été conduite à détruire des drones Houthis. Je vous remercie. Le représentant de la Fédération de Russie a demandé la parole pour faire une autre déclaration et je la lui donne.
Господин председатель, нас не удивляет откровенно слабые аргументы, которые сегодня пытались привести в оправдание своей агрессии Соединенные Штаты и Великобритании. Ведь иных аргументов попросту не существует и не может существовать. Нет никакой, подчеркну, никаких правовых оснований для их атаки на суверенный Йемен. О каком праве на самооборону Лондон и Вашингтон говорит за 1000 миль от собственных границ? С каких это пор это право стало распространяться на коммерческие суда? Тем более следующий, как это подтвердила сама постоянный представитель Соединенных Штатов под флагом третьих государств. Очевидно одно, никакого легитимного мандата на силовые действия у самопровозглашенной коалиции нет. Одно дело защищать коммерческое судоходство, атаки на которое недопустимы, и совершенно иное, непропорционально и незаконно бомбить другое государство. Англосаксонский тандем со своими сателлитами в очередной раз грубо нарушает устав ООН и другие нормы международного права, еще сильнее расшатывая ситуацию на и без того горячем Ближнем Востоке. Новые бомбежки и разрушения – вот это реальный вклад Запада и его эффективная ближневосточная дипломатия. Благодарю вас.
Je remercie le représentant de la Fédération de Russie de sa déclaration. La représentante des États-Unis a demandé la parole à nouveau et je la lui donne.
We have been clear in our statement, despite the fact that my Russian colleague thinks it was weak. We carried out this action under Article 51. And this comes down simply to freedom of navigation, the free flow of commerce, and yes, for the United States, but also for more than 50 nations that have been affected by these attacks, whose ships have been rerouted thousands of miles to avoid violence. Crews have been held hostage, some to this day. Vessels have been fired on and frankly would have been hit without our intervention. And the situation in the Red Sea has become untenable for every single country that's been affected by these attacks. So de-escalation needs to happen. It needs to happen from the Houthis, who are putting all of our shipping lines in jeopardy. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie la représentante des États-Unis de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole à la représentante du Royaume-Uni.
Thank you, President. I'll say briefly, as I said just now in my intervention, we've published a summary of our legal position on last night's strikes, and we have reported to the Council in writing in accordance with Article 51 of the Charter. I think that's comprehensive. Thank you, President.
Je remercie la représentante du Royaume-Uni de sa déclaration. Il n'y a plus d'oratrice ou d'orateur inscrit sur la liste. La séance est levée.